So section 3.4 is really getting down to probably, I would say, the meat of the entire class, because more questions come from agency and sales transactions than probably any other single topic on the test. I mean, I would say that if you're looking for a single section, a single topic, and saying, okay, right here, here's where it's going to come from, this is it. Obviously, that's not to say the other stuff's not going to be tested. It will, but if you're looking for the single biggest, here's where as more questions than any other little concentrated section come from. This is it right here. Unfortunately, this is also the section where I think there are those, moments when people just sort of doubt everything that they think they already know, because it really does sort of become, it depends in a lot of cases. And so what we really want to start to talk about is how agency works in a sales transaction. Now, just kind of a reminder of what we talked about on Wednesday, which was agency is representation. It's that legal hiring by a client of somebody or some company to represent a broker, being a person, or a firm being a company, to represent their best interest, not to make the deal. That's not what agency is. That's transactional brokers. Now, keep in mind, making the deal is part of the job. I'm not saying it's not, but it's not the main part of the job. The main part of the job is representation. The main part of the job is looking out for the best interest of that client who hired us. Ultimately, it always goes back to the client who hired us, the client who signed an agreement with us, with our office, and said, I want you to represent my best interest in this transaction. Like, think about it. Some of you may have experienced this, or you've seen it on TV or whatever. People go talk to an attorney and they start asking the attorney for advice. And the first thing the attorney says is, well, you got to pay me $1. You got to pay me something, because until you pay me, you're not my what?
My client.
Client. Now, in our business, we don't require payment to create that relationship. What we require is an agreement. We require some type of a signed agreement that creates that relationship, but it's still the same idea. They're a customer first. Here's the way I want you to think about it, because sometimes I think it doesn't click into your brain this way, but I want to put it there. Every person we ever come into contact with in this business begins as a what? What C word did they begin as?
As a customer.
Customer. They all, and most of them will remain customers, but a select few of them will hire us. A select few of them will bring us on and say, I want you to look out for my best interest. So think of it this way. If you're going through and you're sending out mailers to everybody in the neighborhood, if you're Seth and you're doing door hangers in the entire neighborhood, and somebody calls you back and says, hey, I got your information. Can you tell me what my house is worth? Are you talking to a client, or are you talking to a customer at that point in time?
Customer.
You're talking to a customer. Now, are you talking to them with the hope that they will become your client at some point in the future?
Yes.
Yes. Because getting them to convert from customer to client is a big part of what we have to do. I mean, we have to sort of sell them on our services that we're worthwhile. In most transactions, we're going to look at the agency relationship as not going directly from the client to the sub-agents or the individual brokers within the firm. most of the time, in most transactions, the client hires who?
The firm.
The firm.
A firm to represent them. Now, notice I said most of the time. Are there going to be certain limited situations where you have brokers that don't work for a firm and the client could hire those people directly?
Yes.
Yeah, right. That's possible. But in most cases, that's not how most of the real estate agents in North Carolina have chosen to work. Most real estate brokers, whether they're, working for a big office of 100 or working for a small office of 2, or maybe even just working for an office of 1, have decided that they want to be underneath the umbrella of a company. And when they're under the umbrella of a company, what is the type of license that that company has?
Firm license.
A firm license. And so most of the time, the clients have actually hired a real estate firm, not hired the broker directly. Here's the thing, though, that does not change that the sub-agents, the individual brokers, work for the firm. So would it be fair to say then that there's this relationship that exists between the firm and the brokers that work in the firm? Would that be fair to say?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And would it be fair to say that there's this relationship that exists between the client and the firm?
Yep.
Yes.
So as long as you understand those two things, the next one hopefully will not come as a big shock. It all flows through. So ultimately, are the brokers also required to look out for the best interest of the client? Because the only way they can look out for the best interest of the firm, who's been hired to look out for the best interest of the client, is by the brokers looking out for the best interest of the client. Does that make sense, that it all has to flow through like that?
Yes.
Right. And that's what this agency relationship really is. Now, when we talk about getting paid in our business can sometimes be dicey. We have one of the most odd compensation models you'll ever find in the real estate industry. There are things about the way compensation works in this business that people who are in the business for 20 years still don't really understand why we do it that way. I don't expect you to learn everything there is to know about compensation in this class. As a matter of fact, I don't expect you to learn much of anything about compensation in this class. We're going to talk about compensation a little bit, but I want you to understand that compensation is not the same thing as agency. Agency is whoever's hired us. Could that be very different than who is paying us in the transaction?
Yeah.
It could be. It is not uncommon in our business, folks, to see a real estate agent, a real estate firm that is being compensated, being paid a commission by a seller, but working for the buyer. Here's what I want you to connect. When we're talking about agency, are we talking about the payment of the compensation from the seller to that firm? Or are we talking about the relationship between the firm and that buyer client that hired them? Which one are we talking about with agency?
Relationship.
We're talking about the relationship. We don't have any concern whatsoever, as from an agency perspective, with that payment arrangement that's happening. That payment arrangement is completely separate and outside of the agency. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Okay. Because that's an important thing to keep in mind about our business. Now, as agents, we have to be delegated to. Our clients give us authority. Our clients give us power. We don't have any power that our clients don't give to us. So think about, we've talked about this like with HOAs, in some neighborhoods. You hear me say this repetitively. The HOA is nothing but your neighbors, right? When you talk about enforcing covenants, the HOA really is just the neighbors.
Right.
Yes.
So in other words, if the HOA is sending you a foreclosure notice, who's actually foreclosing on your property?
Your neighbor.
Your neighbors are.
Mhm.
Is it fair to say that the HOA management company only has the authority that the neighbors have given to the HOA management company?
Yeah.
Yes.
And so in the same way, real estate agents only have whatever level of authority we've been given by our clients in that transaction. I don't want you to think of agent as this switch that just gets thrown on or off. What I want you to think of is agency is more like a dial, and the dial can get turned up or the dial can get turned what?
Down.
Down. You can be an agent and have almost no power whatsoever. Or you can be an agent and have all of the power. Here's what I also want you to think of. Think of it as this gauge right here. And here's the way I want you to think of it when we look at these gauges. And I'm going to remind you on each one of these slides. I want you to think of the gauge as a balance of power between the agent and the client. As the client gives more power to the agent, the client has less power themselves. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
As the gauge tilts more toward the agent, it tilts less toward the what?
The client.
Toward the client.
Mm-hmm.
But the opposite is also true. A client who still wants to make all their decisions is not giving very much authority or power to their who?
Agent.
Their agent.
To their agent. So that's an important thing to get your mind around when it comes to this idea of agency. So let's talk about the lowest power level of all, where you can still be considered somebody's agent. Special agency. Special agency is the type of relationship that gets created when a client says, you know what, I'm not a very good speaker. I'm not very good with my words. I'm not a good negotiator. I want somebody to speak on my behalf. Now listen, I don't want you to do anything on my behalf. Don't you dare agree to an offer. Don't you dare agree to a price. Don't you dare say I will do this unless I tell you first I will do it. I want to make all of my own decisions. The decisions are mine. I just want you to be my mouthpiece. How do we feel about that?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
So if you were given on a test an agency situation where the client still has all decision making, but the agent has the ability to speak or advocate for their client, what kind of agency is that?
A special agency.
Special.
Special agency. By the way, folks, this is by far the most common type of agency that is given to real estate brokers. Think about it. Think about your average real estate broker in a normal sales transaction. Who makes all the decisions?
The client.
The client.
The client does. When there's a decision to be made about the list price, does the special agent give advice to the client?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, but ultimately, who's going to decide what the list price is?
Client.
The client. When an offer comes in, is a special agent going to give advice to the seller about that offer? Are they going to try to negotiate the best possible terms on behalf of that seller?
Yep.
Sure.
Sure, but
Yes.
ultimately, whose decision will it be whether or not that's an offer that needs to be accepted?
The client.
The client.
Client. That is special agency. And that is by far the most common type of power given to real estate agents, which is to say, they don't give us much power at all. They give us the power to speak, but not the power to act. How does everybody feel about that?
Good.
Good.
That's special agency. We can turn the knob up. We can crank the heat up a little bit. Actually, we can crank the heat up quite a bit to general agency. General agency is sort of the medium level of power for an agent, like a real estate agent, as an example. In general agency, the real estate agent has been given some of the decision making. In other words, some decisions can be made by the agent without even talking to who?
The client.
Client.
Client. Some limited decisions can be, which means, can the agent sign some documents on behalf of their client without even talking to the client?
Mhm. Yes.
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 Would those documents be binding on the client the same as if the client had signed them?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, as long as the agent had been given the authority to sign those specific documents, the agent signing them is exactly the same as the client signing them. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Let me give you an example of where this type of agency, and this is again called general agency, exists in real estate. Look at that bottom note down there. It says property managers normally serve as general agents. Think about your normal property manager. Are there going to be decisions throughout the day that the property manager is not going to go to the landlord for because they're just too insignificant?
Right.
Of course. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
The unit 12B called and their air conditioning's not working. Are most property managers going to have to email the landlord and say, can I call the HVAC company because 12B doesn't have air conditioning? Or have they been given the authority to schedule the HVAC company, come get it checked out, maybe even get it fixed and spend the landlord's money fixing it? Have they been given that authority in most cases?
Yes.
Absolutely. Because otherwise they wouldn't be able to adequately function in the job. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mhm.
Yep.
Now, they probably have been given a lot of power. Like they can probably sign leases that would be binding on the landlord. They can probably negotiate prices that would be binding on the landlord. But here's what you need to clearly understand. They do not have, a general agent does not have unlimited power. Let me just ask you a generic question. Do you think a property manager has the legal authority to decide that the children of their landlord client should no longer attend public school, but they should attend a private religious-based school in California?
No, never.
No.
I don't think so. I don't think the property manager has been given the right to take the owner's social security check and spend it on the roulette wheel every month. They haven't been given unlimited authority. So what you need to understand about general agency, because people miss these questions sometimes, understand about general agency, some level of decision-making has been given to the agent, but not what?
No.
Oh.
All.
Not all. I bet you sense what's coming next, right? We went from no decision-making for the agent to some decision-making for the agent. What do you think is next, folks?
All
decisions.
All decisions made by the agent, no decisions made by the client. Everything decided by the agent. That is called universal agency. Let's say that Mandy is named a universal agent for her friend Jordana. So Jordana has given universal agency to Mandy. Can Mandy sign a divorce decree divorcing Jordana from her spouse?
Yes, if they have
Yes.
universal.
Yes, because
Yeah.
she's been given what kind of agency?
Universal.
Universal
Universal
agency.
agency.
Universal.
Can Mandy empty Jordana's bank accounts and spend the money on a big party this weekend?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, because she's been given universal agency. Do you
Limited
all
power.
think, you all think this is a very common occurrence in real estate?
No.
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 Trav, I'm confused. Is
Yes.
this universal agent for properties or are we talking about for life?
See, that's why you're confused, because agency is life. There's no limitation of property when it comes to agency. And that's why I have to drag you through this. Agency is simply about representing someone to do whatever they hired you to represent them to do. So you need to understand, if somebody hires you as their universal agent, what have they hired you to do?
Whatever you.
Everything.
Everything and everything.
Make every
Everything.
decision on their behalf. They will literally not make any decisions. They will not decide what they're going to eat for breakfast. They will not decide what color casket they're going to be buried in. They will not decide when the plug will be pulled on their own life support. You will. You are their universal agent. You will make all decisions for them. Does that sound like the kind of power that we would give to our real estate agent?
No,
No.
No. But
I don't want that power
In
either.
Brittany's case, not her dad either.
No, that's it, and so you gotta recognize when you see a test question about this, you probably shouldn't choose universal agency as an answer on a real estate test because it never happens in real estate. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mhm.
Right. So the most you'll probably be dealing with is that limited or
General
general and
agent.
special.
Right? The most power you can ever realistically expect to see as a real estate agent is general agency. Because in general agency, so to go back to Taj's question, general agency, this person has said, you have my permission to make decisions about this. You are limited to making decisions about this property, about my rentals. You can make all the decisions for me about my rentals, but I'll be damned if you're going to decide to sell my boat. Yeah, no, that's all. That's out of bounds. Do you see the difference there? Right. So when we talk about general agency, what we're saying is it's a limited amount of decision making, whereas special agency is no decision-making authority. It's literally just the authority to speak up for your client. Which one are real estate agents most often, folks?
Special.
Special agents. Real estate agents are almost always special agents, with the rare exception of the property manager that probably serves as a what?
General.
As a general agent. How do we all feel about that now? Pretty
Hey,
good?
Travis, so will this will, sorry,
No, go ahead.
will this, so this will be, this will all be disclosed in writing? Like
It has to
details
be.
in writing? What kind of, okay, thank you.
Excuse me. It has to be. I don't know why I can't talk. It has to be disclosed in writing. In fact, if we go back, we can't give this authority unless we have what? Unless the client has done what?
Hired us.
Has hired us with
Okay,
what kind of an agreement?
Agency.
Agency.
A written agency agreement. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
And so that written agency agreement should be specific and should specify exactly what authority we're giving to the agent. You have this, but not that. How are we all feeling about that?
I have a simple question, if I can ask you real quick.
Sure, go ahead, Howard.
Go to your the next slide with Britney Spears. Yeah, this one. Okay. All right. Hold it right there. We all know what a general agent is now. We all know what a special agent is now. All right. So we got that, or at least I got it. All right. Universal agency. Let's talk about that. So here's a simple question. Why are we even talking about a universal agency in a real estate class? Because we all know what a power of attorney is. Why is this important to discuss?
But do we all know what a power of attorney is?
I think most people know.
Then what's this?
That's a general agent.
Which is also the same thing as a,
Limited,
opportunity.
limited power of attorney.
here's the thing, Howard, and that's why I ask it this way. Agency means the same thing as power of attorney. All agency is power of attorney. The question is, what type of power of attorney do we have? Do we have power of attorney or agency? Because remember, what's the number one example of agency? Think about how we introduced the whole agency discussion on Wednesday. What did I say was the classic example of agency?
An attorney.
An attorney, right?
Attorney, yeah.
So power of attorney and agency are synonyms for each other. They literally mean the same thing. Here's the thing that you're battling with right now, Howard. You've heard that phrase misused your whole life, because when they said power of attorney, what they were really meaning to say was unlimited power of attorney, which is the same thing as universal agency. Britney Spears' dad didn't have a power of attorney over her. He had an unlimited power of attorney over her. Do you see the difference there?
Yeah, I see the difference between that and the general agency. I was just trying to, in my mind, see why this was important in our real estate class, because I didn't think we'll ever come across anything like this in our careers.
Well, you won't from your perspective as a real estate agent, but you will come across it in transactions. Are we going to have people who own property, particularly the elderly, for whom universal agency has been granted to someone else, like their child, for example?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Right? And so we need to understand that if a child has been given universal agency over their parent, who should we actually be talking to when we're presenting those offers and we're going through that situation? Should we be talking to the owner of record, or should we be talking to their universal agent, who's actually going to be the one making the decisions?
To the universe.
Your universal agent.
Do that paperwork.
Does that help, Howard? Oh,
Yeah, it does. It does. Thank you for breaking
Yeah.
it down.
And agency is present in like quite a bit of industries. Ours is just, restricted to real estate, but agency is like present like pretty much everywhere.
Exactly. And yes,
But the reason we
you
the
owe Seth
reason
for this picture of Brittany, because he would always bring her up whenever I would talk about a universal agency. So I
because
had
it's so like commonly talked about, but it is true. Like, whenever you're like in a hospital setting and an unfortunate event or something like that, and they ask like, well, who has the power of attorney? It's misused because there's levels of power of attorneys.
Right. And that's
We
why
are
Yep. And that's why what you just said, the levels of power of attorney, you've heard that, you just didn't realize what they were saying. How many of you have ever heard of a medical power of attorney?
Mhm.
So would a medical power of attorney be example of universal agency, or would that be an example of general agency?
General.
General.
General agency, because you've given that person the power to make only medical decisions. Does that make sense for everybody? And so that's general agency versus the unlimited power of attorney, which gives the right to make any decision.
So when I was lending, we used to tell people they needed to get a specific power of attorney to allow someone to sign for them. So the only thing they were allowed to do then was to sign the documents.
That's right. And that would be general agency. That's general agency or a limited power of attorney. They mean the same thing. So now let's apply this to our role as a real estate broker. Are there going to be times, even in a sales transaction, where we start as a special agent? We've listed the property for sale for the seller. We've marketed it. We've brought them an offer. They signed the offer. They accepted the offer. We're under contract. It's come time for closing, and the seller just doesn't want to show up for closing. They're hours away. They don't want to show up. They don't want to drive 2 hours to the closing. They just want you to send them their money. Can they give up the authority to sign the necessary documents that they would normally themselves personally have to sign at that closing to their agent that they've already hired as a special agent? In other words, could they turn the dial up and upgrade the special agency that they already have to general agency just for the closing? What do y'all think?
Yes.
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 They could sign, and what we would usually refer to that as a limited power of attorney, which gives Travis, and this happens in almost every closing we represent the seller, by the way. Sellers very rarely attend closings anymore. They just don't want to bother to show up. And so they will almost always sign a limited power of attorney, giving their agent the right to sign for them at closing so that they don't have to be there.
Would that have to be notarized or anything, or just signed?
Generally speaking, it has to be notarized, because anytime you're giving someone the legal authority to sign documents on your behalf that are going to be binding, we want to make sure you actually know what you're signing and that you're actually the person signing it. Yeah. So yeah, usually that does need to be notarized. Yes. Most of the time, special agency doesn't need to be notarized because you're not giving, they're keeping all the power to do the stuff themselves, but general agency and above would need to be notarized. Okay. How are we all feeling about those? Pretty good about the differentiation there?
Yes.
Good. Now, that's why I gave you that second slide about limited power of attorney. What does it really mean? If you see that on the test, my suspicion is you will see that on the test. That just means same thing as general agency. It means the limited authority to sign certain things, to make certain decisions that are very limited, like the ones that we get, they're almost laughably funny, the ones we get for real estate closings, because it's like it takes 2 pages to be so specific about what rights we have and what rights we don't have. Like it'll say, you know, like, I delegate my attorney in fact, Travis Everette, to appear in my place at the real estate closing of 117 Deerfield Court, which is scheduled to take place at this time and this place in this county. And I delegate Mr. Everette to accept the closing documents of this transaction to this buyer at this price. And I mean, it's so detailed that basically, if anything changed at that closing, I couldn't sign the documents because I've only been given such a limited, narrow little permission to just sign what they've already agreed to. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we call it a limited power of attorney, because it's tailored down to a certain limited set of powers. Okay. We talked about this on Wednesday, just kind of a reminder. North Carolina, we practice fiduciary brokerage. We do not practice transactional brokerage. And 90%, 99% of what we're going to spend time on in the rest of the class deals with fiduciary brokerage. And we said that was that trust-based relationship. That's that relationship where the client, whoever they are, whether they're the buyer or the seller, expects us to look out for their best interest. Probably the most important word when it comes to agency from the perspective of the licensee, from the perspective of the firm, is this word, exclusive. Now, I think this word, when you talk about this word in a real estate context, it helps to take it away from a real estate context. If you think about it like dating, if you're dating someone exclusively, how many people are you promising to date? And one. You're promising to date one and be faithful to that one. That's what an exclusive relationship means. Well, when we ask a client, whether they be a buyer or seller, to sign an exclusive relationship with our office, we're asking them to do exactly the same thing. We're asking them to commit to working with us exclusively. So here, I want to make sure you've got this really nailed down, this exclusivity thing. If Seth goes out and shows a buyer property today, and the buyer signs an exclusive buyer agency agreement with Trav Talks LLC. The buyer has promised to only allow that one office to represent them in that transaction. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Here's what that means from a practical standpoint, folks. If that buyer goes out the following weekend and looks at property with Sierra because Seth's not available, and Sierra works for a whole different real estate firm because the buyer's impatient. Do you think there are buyers who do that, by the way, who get impatient because their agent, their firm can't jump and go and do right then at that moment what they want? What do y'all think?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For sure. And
They
so the
want
buyer's going to call Sierra and say, hey, can I see this property? And Sierra doesn't know anything at all about this relationship this buyer has entered into with Trav Talks LLC. And the buyer's probably not going to tell the truth about it. Everybody agree with me on that? See, here's the thing. A lot of real estate brokers get so mad about that. Seth is not going to get mad about that at all. As a matter of fact, he's probably going to call me laughing about that. Because here's what he's going to say. Can you believe that Sierra did all the work and I'm going to get paid for it? Because ultimately, who did the client agree to allow to represent them in the transaction and to be compensated for that representation?
Talks.
Talks. And that's what exclusivity means, folks. And that's why it's such an important thing from the perspective of a real estate firm, is getting clients to agree to this promise that they will only engage the services of our one office.
This brings a question I have. I have a friend who was looking at property down here in North Carolina coming from out of state. She was working with a Better Homes and Gardens agent who showed her the property.
Okay.
But before she would show her the property, she made her sign this exclusive offer to sell. I offer to buy, and made it for 6 months. The client didn't want to be restricted to just working with that one agent, but she wouldn't show the property otherwise. And she said that's how it works. Is that true?
No, it's not how it works. I mean, it might be her policy to only show properties to people that are that will sign an exclusive buyer agency agreement, but that's not how it works. I mean, that she should be clear that that's her policy, that's her office policy, not what's required by the law, because it's not. Yeah. When we deal with sales transactions, there's a menu. There's a available sort of number of services that a real estate office can offer to a consumer. Whether that consumer is a buyer or a seller is going to, in some ways, dictate what we offer to them. But basically, it's not our job to determine what type of agency the client wants to have in the transaction. Ultimately, who is going to determine the type of agency that we have in the transaction? Who is that? Who is that going to be?
Client will determine it.
It's the client's choice. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mhm.
And so our job as a real estate broker, as a licensee in North Carolina, is to explain the choices, explain the menu, explain the options that are available to this person, and let them decide what is our relationship going to look like, if there's going to be a relationship at all. And don't forget, another reminder, because it can't come too many times really, ultimately, who is the client engaging the services of most likely?
The firm.
The firm. And that means everybody within the firm owes the same amount of duties and loyalty to that particular person. Does that kind of make sense for everybody? That there is no differentiation of one broker or one sub-agent within the firm from another. Because from the perspective of the buyer or seller, they chose to hire the entire firm. They chose to hire Trav Talks. It just so happens that Seth comes with that he's part of that package. It just so happens that Travis comes with that he's part of that package. But you are hiring the whole package. And every transaction, you're going to see me show visuals with a tug of war. I like to think of a sales transaction as sort of a tug of war between buyer and seller. And why do I show it as a tug of war between the buyer and seller? Not because they're fighting, but because realistically, everything about the transaction is sort of offsetting. If a particular occurrence is good for the seller, it's probably what with relation to the buyer?
Bad.
It's probably not so great for the buyer. It's probably bad for the buyer. You know, purchase price. Which way does the seller want the purchase price to go? Up. Which way does the buyer want the purchase price to go?
Down.
Down. So there they are. They're pulling in opposite directions from each other. Repairs. How many repairs does the seller want to do?
0.
None. How many repairs does the buyer want done?
All of them.
All of them. So there they are. They're pulling in opposite directions. So that's why I use this tug of war visual, because the buyer and the seller are always on opposite sides. And notice it says here, and I think this is an important note, the real question is whether they have help on their side or not. That's another thing to remember. Not every buyer is going to choose to be represented. Are there some buyers who are going to be by themselves in the transaction and choose not to have help?
Yes.
And not every seller is going to choose to be represented. There'll be some sellers who will choose no representation. And we have to recognize that those transactions happen again. And also be really careful with those ing words that we talked about on Wednesday. What someone is doing is not the same thing as who they represent. Someone who is the listing agent simply means they are at that point in time doing something on the seller's side of the transaction. Someone who is the selling agent simply means at that point in time they're doing things, providing services on the buyer's side of the transaction. Does everybody remember that terminology from Wednesday? Okay, I know we went through that in detail on Wednesday. So let's look at the first type of agency that really is going to be important and sort of like the most important type of agency in existence in the real estate world. This is the original type. This is what the OG, is that what I should call it right here? This is the original gangster right here of real estate. This is the basis of our business. It's called single agency. So single agency means the real estate firm is only on one side of the transactions. Everybody okay with that statement? So you've got a real estate firm that's only on one side of the transaction, and the other side has no representation at all. Look at this visual image that you see here in the picture. Does this look like a balanced tug of war, or does it look like one side is going to get the advantage here in this tug of war? What do y'all think?
One side gets the advantage.
One side's most definitely going to get the advantage here. So when you look at this picture right here, talk to me. Who's on the left? If I had to label that person on the left as the buyer or seller, if this is exclusive seller agency where the real estate firm is working for the best interest of the seller, talk to me about this person over here on the left. Who is he?
The buyer.
Buyer.
That's your buyer. They're over there by themselves. They're out there on that island by themselves. This person right here, there's your seller. Well, then who are all of these folks then?
The farm.
That's the firm.
Farm.
The firm's there to help. The firm's there to assist. The firm's there to advise. The firm's there to fight for that seller in this transaction. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Okay. And that's what exclusive seller agent looks like. Now, let's talk about how this comes into existence. The seller hires a firm with what kind of an agreement? They have a written agreement with that firm. And what do we call that agreement?
Listing.
Exclusive, right?
A listing agreement.
Oh,
That's called a listing agreement. When we hire a firm to represent us as a seller in a transaction, the document that we're hiring is called a listing agreement. How many of you have ever heard a real estate agent say, I have a new listing?
Mhm.
What that means is they have a seller who signed a listing agreement. Everybody okay with that?
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay. And so in this case, because the buyer is unrepresented, they are on their own in this transaction. That means most likely, if the firm is any good at its job, who's going to get the better end of this transaction most likely?
The seller.
The seller is. And notice I said this is the original form of real estate, right? This is the oldest form of real estate. This is the one where the entire basis of our business is based around this. This one has been around forever. This is what every real estate firm and every real estate agent did when real estate first became a profession. Now, I will say a couple of things I need to refer you to on this slide. When we have exclusive seller agency, notice right here, how do we talk about the brokers in the transaction? How do we talk about the individual agents that are working in that transaction? How do we talk about them? How do we refer to them? Look at what it says. We refer to them as sub-agents of who?
Seller.
Of the seller. The of the seller part simply tells you whose side of the transaction they're on. And why do we not call them agents of the seller? Why do we call them sub-agents, which is kind of the same thing as subcontractors?
the firm is the agent. Is the agent.
There we go. The firm is the agent. The firm was hired directly by the client. The brokers work for the firm. So therefore, they are the sub-agents of the seller. Sometimes you'll see this is referred to as seller sub-agency. You'll ask a real estate agent, well, who do you represent? Oh, I'm a seller sub-agent. If they say that, whose team are they on? I'm a seller sub-agent.
Seller.
Seller.
They're on the seller's team. They're on the seller's team. They represent the seller and only the seller. That makes sense for everybody?
Mhm.
Okay, good, good. Now, I mentioned how this document is really important. The listing agreement. This document creates the relationship between the firm and the client. This is the document that's going to create the relationship between the firm and the client. Before this document is signed, there is no relationship between the firm and the client. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mhm.
Yes.
Here's what I want to point out. This is going to be tested on the North Carolina section because this is a very North Carolina thing right here. Read this sentence right here. The seller must hire their broker officer firm with a written agreement up front before the broker officer firm provides any marketing service. Would a sign in the front yard, folks, be considered a marketing service?
Yes.
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 So you don't put a sign in the front yard until what's happened?
That list.
have an agreement.
Until that seller
Agreement.
has signed that listing agreement. Would posting on Facebook, y'all, I got a new listing coming next week in Cary. It's awesome. Would that be a marketing service?
Yes.
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 Yes. Don't do that until you have a written listing agreement. You're not free as a real estate licensee in this state to tell anybody anything at all about that listing until you have a signed written listing agreement. Is everybody okay with that?
Yes.
That's a very North Carolina specific rule. Here's the great thing about this document. when you have this document signed, I know exactly how you're going to feel, especially in this market. Do you all think in this market, if you can get one of these signed, you feel like you just made yourself some money?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Because we know that property is going to do what?
So,
We know it's going to sell. And not only is it going to sell, how is it going to sell?
Quickly.
Quickly.
Quickly. And for a lot of money.
Yeah.
So as soon as you get one signed, here's exactly how you're going to feel.
We going. What a money reside. What money reside. What a money reside. Money reside. Okay, let me tell you something. I'm doing something real big this month.
Because the listing agreement is where the money resides, folks. I mean, that is the cornerstone basis for our business. You know, if you get that listing agreement signed, you're going to make some money. Listings are king. They always have been. And yes, I love him. He's hilarious to me. I don't know why. I don't know why it tickles me every time. I don't know why. If you've never seen that video, you've missed out on life. You'll have to check him out sometime. And that's his whole stick. That's all he does is where the money resides thing. But it's still enough. It's enough. The total opposite of exclusive seller agency is exclusive buyer agency. And this is, by the way, still single agency. This is still single agency. So what do I mean when I say single agency still?
You hired one firm.
Well, that's exclusive, but what does the single refer to specifically? That firm is only working on what?
The seller has
For
no
one person.
representation.
For one side.
One side.
One side. It's going to be one-sided. Whenever we have single agency, it's going to be one-sided. That firm has been hired to only work on what? One
side
of the transaction. So this is still single agency, and it is the exact polar opposite of exclusive seller agency, because now the firm that's been hired to work on one side has not been hired to work on the seller's one side. They've been hired to work on the what?
buyers.
The buyer. So if you look at our visual here, who is this person right here?
The buyer.
Buyer.
Seller.
Seller.
Oh, that's the
Seller.
seller.
Oh,
If this is exclusive buyer agency, that's the seller, because who has all the help in exclusive buyer agency?
firm.
buyer.
The buyer does. You got your buyer over here who's got representation from a firm in exclusive buyer agency, and the seller has no representation. Does that make sense for everybody?
Oh, like a FISBO?
There it is. Like a what? What do we call these horrible, awful people who do this type of transaction as sellers?
FISBO.
We call them FISBOs. For sale by owner. How many of you have ever heard that phrase before? That property is for sale by owner. When you see that, what that means is that's a seller who has chosen, and I'm sure we can guess what the motivation is. What do you think the seller's motivation is for putting themselves on that island and being unrepresented? Why would they want to do that?
Not paying
Make
commission.
more
Don't
money.
pay commission.
They don't want to pay a commission.
Money.
Exactly right. They don't want to sign that. So what document is that seller not signing when they put their property on the market?
Listing.
Listing
Listing.
A
Listing.
listing agreement. Now, here's what I want you to understand. And this is where starting to wrap your brain around the way things work is going to be really necessary here. I'm going to go back to our picture for just a second. The seller, remind me here, has not signed a listing agreement, correct?
Correct.
Correct.
So I'm gonna just add that note on here. No listing. Is it also fair to say that the reason they didn't sign a listing agreement is because they did not want to pay a commission? Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Yes.
No commission. Here's where you've got to break your association between compensation and agency. Who is this firm working for?
The buyer.
Or the buyer.
For the buyer. do they owe the buyer all of their best efforts in the transaction?
Yes.
Yes.
But here's the question, how are they going to get paid?
By the
From the
seller.
buyer.
Seller.
Here's the answer. We
Seller.
don't know, and we don't care. We don't know, and we don't care. That's for them to figure out. It has nothing to do with the representation, because agency and compensation are not the same thing, folks. Let me ask you.
that-
Okay, go ahead.
So is that something that we would say to our buyer potentially?
Well, I mean, that just depends. Are you willing to work for free?
Mm-mm.
No.
Okay. So then there's your business decision. I'm not willing to work for free, which, by the way, I respect as a business decision, because I'm not willing to work for free either. So what conversation do you think I have with the buyer?
They may potentially be responsible for the cost.
Compensation.
If you buy a property
Compensation.
where the seller is not listed, if you buy a FSBO, who's likely going to have to pay us some money?
Yes.
But in actuality, don't you just raise the sales price to pay your commission?
Well, the seller and the buyer could agree to do that. That's up to them, you know, and that's why I said we don't know how they're going to get paid, and that doesn't really matter about the agency part of it. By the way, even in this type of agency, watch this. Could the firm bring that offer to the seller and say, Mr. Seller, we know you're not listed with anybody, but we have an offer on your property, but our buyer has instructed us to inform you that we should only present that offer to you if you agree to compensate us. Could that conversation happen?
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because folks, the compensation agreement is completely separate from the representation agreement. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mhm.
Yes.
So where this firm decides to get their compensation, however they decide to get their compensation, does not change this relationship at all. Is everybody good with me on that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's why I like to come back and point that out. Okay. So in this transaction, single agency, buyer agency, the seller has chosen to be unrepresented, which we normally refer to as a FSBO. Well, just like there's a listing agreement that a seller would sign to create that sort of agency relationship with the firm, guess what kind of exclusive agreement we also could sign for a buyer to hire us? The
Seller agree.
exclusive what? Well, we don't
Compensation.
call it a selling agreement. We call it a what?
Compensation.
Exclusive
Buyer.
buyer agency.
Exclusive buyer.
It's called a buyer agency agreement. It's called a buyer agency agreement. It's a little bit more of a descriptive terminology than the listing agreement is. So the agreement that the seller signs to hire a firm to represent them is called a what?
Listing agreement.
A listing agreement. The agreement a buyer would sign to hire a firm to represent them is called a what?
Buyer agency.
Buyer agency agreement. Now, I've kind of given you a couple notes up there at the top. It says buyers can hire a firm verbally for a limited time. Let's talk about that real quickly here. I'm going to highlight that so we can talk about it. Let me ask you this question before we go any further. Can a seller hire a firm verbally?
No.
No.
No, we made that clear. Sellers have to hire us in writing from the very first beginning, correct?
Correct.
Correct.
We are not allowed to offer any services whatsoever to a seller unless we have a written agreement. Everybody good with that?
Yes.
Okay. However, the rules are different for buyers. Buyers have the flexibility, and therefore buyers agents have the flexibility to be hired verbally for a limited amount of time. This is most definitely going to be tested. And on what section of the exam? Look what you see on the screen.
North Carolina.
North Carolina.
North Carolina.
This is North Carolina specific, and it's definitely going to show up in the North Carolina specific section of the exam. It says a buyer can hire a firm verbally for a limited amount of time. They can hire a firm to represent them with an oral agreement, but they must, there's that word, must put the oral agreement into writing. And when does it say it has to happen? When does that has to, when do we have to put that agreement, this agreement into writing?
Before they can negotiate.
Before we can negotiate on their behalf, and most importantly, and probably what's going to show up on the test, if I had to guess as the way they will explain it, before we can submit an offer on their behalf. So here's what that means, because I know when you start hearing rules like that, it's hard for you because you're not in the situation. It's hard for you to apply it to a real world situation. Let's say that Summer has gotten her license, power of positive thinking, right? Summer's got her license. She gets a phone call from a buyer that is hot to trot, ready to see a property. Can Summer go out and show that property to that buyer without having a written agreement? And this kind of goes back to Elizabeth's question earlier. Can Summer go out and show that property to that buyer without having a written agreement with that buyer? Is that allowable in North Carolina?
Yes.
Yes. Even if Summer does not have an agreement with the seller, even if Summer is not the listing agent, she can go and show that property to that buyer as a verbal or oral buyer's agent if she chooses. Now, she doesn't have to, but she can. Is everybody clear with me on that?
Yes.
Yep.
Now, can she offer advice to that buyer with that oral buyer agency agreement?
Sure.
Yes.
Yes. Can she tell that buyer what she thinks would be a fair price to pay for that property with that verbal buyer agency agreement?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can she take that buyer back for a second showing the next day with that verbal buyer agency agreement?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. The buyer says, all right, I'm ready, Summer. I want to make an offer on it.
Sign this
So
agreement.
now you have to be
Yep, sign the agreement.
sign agreement.
Right then, Summer, if she has not already done it, is going to have to get out this document right here. Because at that point in time, Summer cannot go any further in the transaction unless that buyer signs a written buyer agency agreement. Summer is not allowed to present an offer to, because think about it, because here's what Summer would be doing. She would be reaching out to other people, the other side of the transaction, to a seller and saying, I represent a buyer who wants to make an offer on your property. You're not allowed to say to that seller, I represent a buyer, unless you actually what?
Been hired.
Fine.
Been
Represent the buyer.
hired to represent that buyer. And that's why you've got to have this agreement in writing before you can present an offer. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's the end of the road for the verbal buyer agency. That's a really important note for North Carolina. Okay. So this same information again here on a different slide. Verbal or oral buyer agency can exist for a time, which is different than listings. But look at this statement right here. And this is what Summer's got to be worried about right here, folks. That verbal or oral buyer agency agreement that she has with that buyer, is it binding in any way? Has the buyer promised to only work with Summer's firm?
No.
No. Could the buyer be taking advantage of Summer and have Summer show the property to him a bunch of times, give the buyer a bunch of advice, and then the buyer use their cousin who's in a different town who also has their real estate license to actually submit the offer?
Happens all the time.
Yes.
Yes. And that happens all the time. And that's the risk that Summer runs, because now I'm going to back up. Could Summer, and this goes back to Elizabeth's question, refuse to show that property without a written buyer agency agreement?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Sure. There's no requirement that Summer has to participate in verbal buyer agency. There's just the ability if she wants to. So ultimately, you all will have to make a decision about how much of this verbal buyer agency you're willing to participate in. Now, personally, I think it's necessary. I think the treatment that Elizabeth's friends got is way too pushy. I would never go show a buyer a property or show up to show them a property and say, I'm not opening the door till you sign an agreement, because I'm putting myself in the shoes of the buyer. They don't know me. That seems crazy to me, to commit to, exclusively work with this agent that you just met. So I always feel like I'm going to invest in this person and take a chance on this person, and feel like if I show them my value, they wouldn't want to hire somebody else. But that's me and my personal decision. That also does not mean I would not take a buyer and show them 26 properties over the course of 6 months with no buyer agency agreement.
Right.
After 1 or 2 times, I'm going to say, like, okay, clearly you want to continue to work together. Let's go ahead and get an agreement in place.
Okay, so my friend offered to do it for this specific property
Yep.
just that day.
Yep.
And she refused all of those requests.
Yeah, and that can be done. That's smart of your friend as well, to do it for, that property for that day, But of course, your friend could have said, well, that's fine. I don't need to see the property. You know what your friend could have done that would have really soured the buyer's agent? Simply said, well, I see the sign out there. I'm pretty sure the listing agent will get their ass over here and show it in a heartbeat.
Right on. That would have been the thing to do.
I bet their tune would have changed in a big hurry then.
Mm-hmm.
Big hurry.
Yeah.
All right. How are we feeling so far? Pretty good?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as sort of our last hurrah before lunch, I want to introduce the idea of the co-brokered transaction, because then when we come back from lunch, we're going to get a little bit more, get into the deep end of the pool, because we're going to talk about dual agency. But before we do that, I want to talk to you about the co-brokered transaction. Now, realistically, a co-brokered transaction is not that different from these transactions. It's not that different from exclusive seller agency. It's not that different from exclusive buyer agency. So why talk about it separately? Here's why. Now we don't have single agency with one firm anymore. How many firms are involved in a co-brokered or cooperative transaction?
2.
Yeah.
This is 2 firms. This is not one firm representing both sides. This is 2 separate firms. This is our buyer right here. So this is buyer Betty. And Betty decided to hire XYZ properties. And then over here on the other side, we have seller Sam, who decided to hire ABC Realty. Now, are ABC Realty and XYZ Properties the same company, or are they 2 different companies?
2 different companies.
Different.
2 entirely different companies that have nothing to do with each other. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
But the buyer chose to have representation from one company. The seller chose to have representation from a whole separate company. And those 2 companies will have to figure out a way to work with each other in the transaction, but working against each other at the same time. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
So again, they're working with each other, but against each other, because XYZ is going to fight for who?
Buyer.
The buyer.
Buyer. And ABC is going to fight for who?
Sam.
Seller.
Sam the seller, right? And they both have a separate job to do. So why do we call it a cooperative transaction or a co-brokered transaction? Because ultimately, is Sam and Betty going to ever talk to each other in this transaction? Or is all of the communication going to look like this?
It's going to look like that.
Yeah. The 2 firms will go through each other.
All of the communication is going to happen between the agents, between the firms. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mhm.
In other words, Betty's going to tell XYZ what she wants them to do, and they're going to do it. But when they reach out, they're not going to reach out to the seller because the seller now has an agent. This is why, folks, we should always ask this very important question whenever we come into contact with somebody. Do you have a what?
Agent.
Do you have an agent? Because here's the reason you ask that question. If somebody says yes, how much further are you going in the conversation with them?
You need to stop.
Stopping.
You're not going any further. No matter what the point of talking to them was up to that point, if they say, yes, I have an agent, you can continue the conversation, but with who?
Their agent.
With their agent. That's why they have one.
If you think of it like attorney,
That's
right?
it.
And
Talk
law
to my
firm,
attorney. Right?
talk to my-
That's it. It's exactly the way it is. And listen, should we as real estate brokers have basically the same conversations that attorneys have with their clients all the time, which is you don't talk to anybody. You let them talk to me and I'll do the talking. Should we have that same conversation with our buyers and sellers?
We should.
Yes.
I do all the time.
Well, you have to keep the buyer and seller apart at all costs, really.
That's it. You don't want these people in the same room with each other. You don't, listen, I have seen, like, you would not believe sometimes the animosity between two people who have never met each other. Because here's what happens that you're not privy to. The buyers go home at night and they talk crap about the sellers. I can't believe they think that their house is worth this kind of crazy money. Yeah, I'll pay it because the market's crazy, but these people are out of their damn mind and they better be fixing some of this crap. That conversation is going on behind closed doors. And here's what the conversation is behind the seller's closed doors that you're not seeing either. These buyers are crazy. I got 26 other offers and they want to ask me to fix the stupid plunger in the toilet in the hall bath. Are they out of their mind? They can change that damn plunger themselves. I'm not fixing a damn thing. All of that is going on behind the scenes. Folks, if you put them in the same room with each other, that's going to boil over. They're going to go, somebody's going across a table at somebody at that closing. And you had no idea it was coming. Don't put them in the same room. That's why they have what? Agents. That's what we're there for. That's why we're there to soften the blow, right? That's our function. And that's why it's so important to ask if somebody has an agent, because we want to honor those relationships. We want to make sure that we respect that relationship that somebody has and only follow those the agency relationships, respect it. In a co-brokered transaction, you do have two firms. You have a list. This is the first time where we have two firms serving the two roles in the transaction. You have a firm that has been hired exclusively by the seller, and we will call them what in that transaction?
Listing
The
firm.
listing
It's
firm.
confirmed.
Listing firm. And you have a separate firm that has been hired exclusively by the buyer, and we're going to call them what?
Selling.
The selling firm.
buyer's firm.
Selling firm. Remember those ING words talk about what we're doing. So the firm that has been hired to work on the seller side is called the listing firm. And the firm that has been hired to work on the buyer side is called the what?
Selling.
buyers.
Firm, the selling firm. The selling firm is going to represent the buyer in this co-brokered transaction. Is everybody okay with that statement?
Mhm.
And I could see this causing some confusion in regards to those terms. It's very important to make sure that you differentiate that listing and selling is only telling you what action you are doing. Then you got to see if they went a step further and said they have an agreement with the listing side. They've been employed by the listing or selling side. So
That's exactly right. What Seth is saying is this is what they're doing, and this is who they represent.
Mhm.
This is what they're doing. This is who they represent, right?
So a really good question on that same thought is, could you represent the listing side while still performing a selling side function or
Sure.
action?
Sure, if you're talking to the buyer, if the listing agent is the one showing the buyer the property, are they also functioning as the selling agent at that point in time?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, right?
And if they let the appraiser in or they let the termite guy in, they're then performing a buyer's agent thing.
Right, a selling function, right? If you're letting somebody in on behalf of the buyer, you're performing a selling function, no matter who you represent in the transaction. That's exactly right. Because the ING part is about what you're doing, not who you work for. Okay.
And vice versa. If you represent the selling side, you could be getting square footage, putting it somewhere in the MLS, that kind of thing, and do a listing action if you're representing the selling side.
It is what you're doing, not who you represent. Who we represent is different than what we're doing in that moment, is what we're trying to say. And that's why these terms throw people for a loop, because you want them to be like labels that stick, but they don't stick. If I'm an agent in the transaction and I'm putting a sign in the front yard, I'm listing. Well, 15 minutes later, I'm showing a buyer the property. I'm what?
Selling.
I'm selling. Did who I represent ever change? No.
No.
I still represent whoever I represented before I started. But what I was doing changed. And that's what where the listing and selling words really come into play, is what we're doing.
And so just to kind of beat the dead horse, what you're doing will not always tell you who you represent. So if you're showing a buyer a property and they don't tell you you represent the buyer, it doesn't mean that you represent the buyer.
That is exactly right.
Travis, can you give us how a question about this distinction would appear on the test?
You won't get a question about the distinction. They're not going to delve into the distinction as far as a question. What they will simply do is use the word listing and selling in questions. And I don't want that to throw you for a loop. You know, if they say the selling agent in the transaction, they simply mean the agent who brought the buyer in the house. Whether they represent the buyer or not, they brought the buyer in the house.
So then on the contrary side of that, they could say the selling agent who represents the buyer then would tell us we brought the buyer and we also represent them.
And they may not even use the word represent. They could say the selling agent is showing a buyer client. Well, that word client tells you that they represent them, right? What Seth is trying to get you to see is the distinction of there's two questions that have to be answered. What are they doing and who do they work for while they're doing it? Because those may not always be perfectly aligned with each other, you know?
Which
So as an example, I'm sorry, go ahead, Seth.
I was just going to say, it just goes back to something I heard Grant say at the beginning of class, I believe. One word can change the entire thing.
It can. Yeah. So like, as an example, I'll give you an example. Everybody knows Seth and I work for the same firm, correct? Okay. So the listing that I have at Lake Gaston, can we all agree that the firm and every broker in the firm represents the seller? Can we all agree on that?
Yes.
Yes.
Let's just say that Seth held an open house at that listing. Is everybody with me?
Yeah.
Who's he representing while he's holding the open house?
Seller.
Seller.
Seller, right? Because our firm has an agreement with the seller that the seller hired us to represent them. Everybody good with it so far? Buyer comes to the open house. Buyer says this, I love it. I want to make an offer on it. I don't have an agent. I don't need an agent. I don't want an agent. I just want to make an offer on the property. Do you think Seth is going to help the buyer accomplish their goal of making an offer?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Of course he is, because his job is to represent the best interest of the seller. And clearly it's in the best interest of the seller that this buyer be able to make an offer. Is everybody with me on that?
Yes.
Right.
Now, here's where you go. Here's the magic that comes into understanding this terminology. On that contract, there's going to be a line down at the bottom that says, who's the listing agent in this transaction? There's going to be another line that says, who's the selling agent in this transaction? Whose name do you think is going to be on the listing agent line for the
Trav
transaction.
Talks.
Trav Talks.
Trav Talks.
Not Trav Talks, because now we're talking about individual broker within the transaction. There were no people. Whose name is going to be on that line as the listing agent? If Travis is the one who took the listing for Trav Talks and Travis is the one that put in the MLS, whose name is going to be on there as the listing agent?
You, Travis.
Travis. But whose name is going to be on the line as the selling agent?
Seth.
Seth. But here's the thing, right below those lines, it's going to say, who does the listing agent represent? And there's going to be a box that says the seller and a box that says the buyer. What box are we going to check that Travis represents who?
Seller.
The seller. And then right below the selling agent line, there's going to be a box to check that says the selling agent represents who? The seller or the buyer? And what box are we going to check for Seth? The seller, folks, because his firm was hired by who?
The seller.
Seller. And what did the buyer say? I don't have an agent. I don't want an agent.
I don't want an agent.
I don't
Through you
need
and
an
your
agent.
agency, all I want is to make an offer. And that's what this is, the association that Seth is trying so hard to break for you on. He's right to keep hitting this because you don't get it until you get it. And when the light bulb finally goes off about that terminology, you're like, oh, he's the selling agent because he's the one who worked with who?
The seller.
The buyer.
Buyer.
Selling
selling the house.
agents always work with. Working with and work is not working for. Who did he work with?
Buyer.
The buyer.
The buyer. He showed the buyer the property. He wrote the offer for the buyer. He's probably never even met the seller. Who is he working with, folks?
Buyer.
Buyer. And the fact that he's working with that buyer, talking to that buyer, showing the property to that buyer makes him the selling agent. And that has zip diddly not a shit to do with who he works for in that transaction. He works for whoever his office has a written agreement with for representation. And who is that in this transaction?
Seller.
Seller. So here, all of that to make this point. Could an agent representing the seller function as the selling agent in the transaction?
Yes.
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 The ing words are telling us what our action is doing. The key in that scenario is that nowhere did we say this is a client. The buyer is a client. The buyer has hired us as representation.
That's right. That's exactly right. So now let me
So
ask
in
you,
that situation, did Seth work for free?
but
Yeah,
here's
that
the
was my
thing.
question.
You're asking a question we can't answer because you're trying to do the very thing, Grant, and I love you, but you're trying to do the very thing which I told you not to do. What two things don't mix?
Compensation and relationship.
Compensation and relationships. They have nothing to do with one another.
Gotcha.
Seth works for a real estate firm. I would assume that if that real estate firm is being compensated in the transaction, and since they are the listing firm, I'm assuming they're being compensated, that real estate firm would look at an agent within their firm that did an open house at one of their listings, that wrote an offer from a buyer that showed up at that open house and say, gee, gosh, golly, Willikers, thanks for doing that, Seth. We should pay you for that. But is that completely and totally up to the firm and their internal policy?
Yes. And also the way that I remember this might be asked is what agency duties would Seth owe to the buyer?
None.
There you go. That's a great question. What would he owe to the buyer?
Nothing.
None, because he wasn't hired.
Nothing.
The buyer is his
He would-
what? Are they his client or customer?
Customer.
Customer.
What is he owe? to the
Just honesty
customer?
and fairness.
Fairness.
Honesty and fairness. That's
But
it.
don't let a question like that trip you up either, because technically what I would be owing to the buyer would be exclusive seller agency. because I represent the seller.
You represent the
So
seller.
that's what I owe to them. Since I represent the seller to the buyer, I'm giving them exclusive seller agency, which means I don't represent your best interest.
Here's how we know, folks, that's still exclusive seller agency. How many firms were involved in that transaction?
One.
This
One.
One. Now, here's the most important question. How many people did that one firm represent in that transaction?
Two.
One.
One.
They represent.
Represent, work
Stop
for.
time working with somebody as representing them. That's these. You have to break that association. Sometimes I wish I had a bully whip to hit you with when you do that. How many people Trav Talks represent? Look out for their best.
How many agency agreements?
One.
There's a good question.
One.
How many employment contracts did Trav Talk sign? Just what?
One.
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 And if it's one firm on one side of the transaction, that is exclusive something, right?
Mhm.
And if it's exclusively on the seller side, what do we call that kind of an agency relationship? That is exclusive seller
Single.
agency and single agency, right?
And then one more would be, even though I am working with the buyer, therefore I'm the selling agent, my action brought the buyer to the transaction. What would an agency term be for me in that situation?
Like such as what?
Between the seller and the buyer.
Well, you're an exclusive
Customer.
seller agent,
Would it be a also a sub-agent
sub-agent of the seller.
of the seller?
Right, same thing. Yeah, okay, that works. Sub-agent of the seller, exclusive seller agent. Who's his client?
Seller.
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 Who's his customer?
The buyer.
Buyer.
That's it. How many of you feel like, some of you that may have made it worse, but how many of you feel like the lights started to come on, flicker into existence a little bit there, that terminology selling has nothing to do with who you work for,
Mhm.
Yes.
Yes.
right?
For sure.
There is a very vast difference in our business of working with someone and working for someone. When we're talking about agency, we're talking about who we work for. When we're talking about those ING words, we're talking about who we're working with, who is in front of us, who are we providing services to. Here's the thing, and this is, now you really want to get into the deep end of thinking about this. Seth is working with the buyer in that transaction, correct?
Correct.
But who's he looking out for? Everything that comes out of his mouth better be geared toward getting the transaction better for who?
For the seller.
Listing side.
For the seller. Is that buyer working with a snake in the grass?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Oh, yes, they are, because they have chosen to work with the one person who is going to work against them in the transaction. They have chosen to work with someone who is going to work against them. And you
Now
know
they won't
what?
do it blindly, but
There's an expression I like about that. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. And that's the buyer. They are playing a stupid game and they're going to win a stupid prize, because Seth is going to probably take advantage of them in that transaction, not in an illegal way, but his job is to represent the best interest of who?
The seller.
seller.
The seller. So here's going to be the question the buyer's going to say. Well, do you think we should get an inspection on the house? Is Seth going to answer that question?
I'm gonna say, I don't know. What do you want to do?
Whatever you decide.
And if he
Whatever
does
you tell him.
answer, and if he does answer it, who's he going to favor with the answer?
Seller.
The seller.
Seller. He's certainly not going to say to the buyer, absolutely, you should always get a home inspection. You need to know what you're buying, because they're not his what?
Fine.
They're not his.
Fine.
It's a
Now,
different.
when you're in that situation that Seth's in, can you say to the client, I'm representing the seller in
Well,
this,
you just called him a client. Don't call them that if they're not one.
the customer, and you say, I'm representing the seller in this transaction. Now, if you were to hire me, then I could advise you on this offer.
Well, we're going to talk about that when we come back, because see, here's the problem with that. They can't hire Seth. They could hire Seth's
Travis.
firm.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is, hasn't somebody else already hired Trav Talks in that transaction?
Yes,
The
the
seller.
seller. Yes.
Seller
the
has.
listing.
And so that takes us in a whole different direction called dual agency, which is
Dual agency, yes.
dark
I
frontier.
think William had a question.
Yeah, yeah, you might have to pull out the bully whip on this one, but so Seth says, when I go to get the listing agreement, the seller agrees to work with me, but then there's also a conversation.
Stop. I have to stop you, and I have to correct you when you say something wrong, because the rest of your question is going to be presupposed on a mistake. The seller did not agree to work with you. Who did the seller agree to work with?
Trav Talks.
Your firm, right? Whatever your firm.
My firm.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, now we go.
Okay, so now once we had that conversation of them working with me, I also have a separate conversation concerning compensation. Now, when I have that conversation, it's going to come up to percentages and say, well, 3% to the buying, 3% to the listing.
Why is it automatically going to come up to that? That's your choice what you charge.
Well, I mean, whatever. I'll have a compensation conversation. So my question is Seth, since I have an agreement that says that commission is going to be split, will Seth be able to get any of that commission? Because they said they give me 6%.
You're asking a question that can only be answered from the perspective internally of the firm. Here's what
It will absolutely be individual.
That would be a foolish way to have a listing agreement. Here's what my listing agreement say. This is what we charge. What we do with it is our business. Whether we split it and pay another firm, or we don't split it and don't pay another firm, that's up to us. This is what we charge. So,
okay.
Here's
so
what
Trav Talks would get the full 6%.
So, he ain't gonna get the full 6% because I'm gonna pay my damn self now. Hold on, you've gone way too far. Here's the thing. In all seriousness, if that happened, that listing is at 5.5%. That's what the listing agreement's for on that property. 1.25 million at 5%. You can do the math on it. It's a lot of money. It's a big commission. Okay. And here's what our listing agreement says. It says, if a firm other than ours brings us a buyer, then we will pay them 2.5% of the sales price. That's what our listing agreement says. If a firm brings us a buyer. That word if's an important word. Everybody follow me on that?
Mm-hmm.
In this case that we just presented to you, did another firm bring us a buyer, or did our same firm produce the buyer?
The same
firm.
Same firm did. My listing agreement simply says our fee is 5.5%, no matter whether we produce the buyer or somebody else does. It just says if somebody else does, we will pay them out of our 5.5. But if we produce the buyer as well, do we have to share any of that 5.5% with the other firm?
No.
No, because there is no other firm. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
And now that's
Yeah.
where it goes right back to being an internal discussion of Trav Talks LLC, because the seller is going to live up to their end of that agreement and pay 5.5% to Trav Talks LLC. And then the firm can individually decide how to distribute that money internally among its affiliated brokers.
Gotcha.
So
Thank you.
it most likely, we would pay Seth handsomely in that transaction, because it's a huge benefit to the firm if he produces a buyer so that the firm brings in the entire 5.5% versus having to share a portion of it. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in a perfect world, based on what I just said, wouldn't every firm prefer to find the buyer for their own listings rather than have to rely on somebody else to help them?
Yep.
Because if you rely on somebody else to help you, what are you probably doing with the money?
Splitting it.
Splitting
You're
it.
probably sharing it with the other office. But if you can manage as your own office to find the buyer, there's no sharing.
Got it.
Now, that doesn't mean there won't be sharing or splitting within the firm and the agents within the firm, but that's an internal, remember, once the money gets to the firm, we're out of the discussion in this class. That's internal firm policy, whatever contract they have. They're going to pay according to whatever their internal policy is. Okay. That help, William? I think so. He took his hand.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right. Well, I think that's probably a good spot for us to take a lunch break. What do y'all think about that?
Yay.
So before lunch, we talked about 3 of the 4 menu items when it comes to agency in a sales transaction. We talked about exclusive seller agency, which is single agency, meaning there's only one real estate firm involved in the transaction, and that firm has been hired by which one party has signed an agency agreement when we're talking about exclusive seller agency.
The seller.
Seller, right? Exclusive seller agency. Seller agency. Exclusive seller, you gotta stop listening to the front of the word and listen to the end of the word, right? That it's ing is the only one that your ears should perk up on. Seller is seller is seller is seller. Okay. So when we say exclusive seller agency, who has signed the agreement?
Seller.
The seller.
Seller.
Then we talked about exclusive buyer agency, which is also single agency, where there's only one firm involved in the transaction, and that firm has been hired by the buyer to represent the buyer's best interest. And then right before lunch, we talked about the co-brokered transaction, which is a transaction where you have how many firms or offices involved in the transaction?
2.
One.
Co-brokered.
2 firms.
One.
Co-brokered. 2. Co means more than one. Co-brokered. Co-brokered transaction means how many firms, folks?
More than one.
More than one. In this case, 2.
2.
Right? And what that means is that if there are 2 firms, that must be because they are each on opposite sides of the transaction.
Look, I'm not trying to single anybody out, but I think I heard somebody say general, and that's not what we're talking about.
Oh, I didn't hear that part. I missed that one.
I have my headphones in.
The seller has hired representation with a listing agreement. They've hired a listing firm to represent them. And the buyer has hired representation from a separate firm, different office, different broker in charge, through a buyer agency agreement. So in that case, each office has only signed one representation agreement, but both parties in the transaction have signed representation agreements. So they both have different representation, and the 2 firms are going to work against each other in the transaction. Is everybody okay on a co-brokered transaction?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That only leaves one possibility. And unfortunately for you all, it's the one that requires the deepest level of thought, the most introspection, creates the most problems. Dual agency. Dual agency is the opposite of single agency. Single agency means only one side of the transaction has chosen to be represented. So talk to me about dual agency. Then if that's the opposite of single agency, what does that mean? First and foremost, we know in the transaction, is there only going to be one side with representation, with somebody working on their behalf, with somebody fighting for them, or are both sides going to have representation here?
Both sides.
Both sides have representation. So then what makes that different than a co-brokered transaction? This is what you need to see right away, because this is a huge difference between this and a co-brokered transaction. What is going to be different in a dual agency transaction if the buyer has signed a buyer agency agreement and the seller has signed a listing agreement, then why isn't that just a co-brokered transaction? What is different here in a dual agency transaction?
They're using one firm.
One firm, one office, one broker in charge. Both parties, for whatever reason, have decided that it is in their best interest to hire the same firm to represent them. Folks, that is the definition of dual agency in North Carolina. One transaction, two parties, one firm. The same firm represents both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction at the same time. There are obvious and glaring problems that come up when you start to talk about dual agency. The truth is that we have two parties who are not headed in the same direction. The buyer and the seller, everything is opposite for them. Is it reasonable to think that one office can work for the best interest of both the buyer and the seller at the same time?
Mm.
What do y'all think?
No.
Best interest.
Is it reasonable to think that Mike Krzyzewski can work in the best interest of Duke University and the University of North Carolina in the same game at the same time?
Oh, no. I would say no, but that doesn't work for me.
Is it reasonable to think that the same political consultant group could advise the Democrats and the Republicans in the same election at the same time?
It's possible.
I mean, it's possible if they're subjective.
I'm not talking about what's possible. I said to get the best possible result for both of them. Stop trying. Is it possible
in today's world?
Is it possible to split a baby between two people? Yes, you can saw them in half, but that is not a good outcome for the baby.
Yes.
And that's what you need to admit about dual agency. There is zero possibility that this results in the best possible transaction for either person, because if it's the best possible transaction for one, what does that mean about the other one?
The worst possible.
The worst possible transaction. And isn't the firm representing both of them, folks?
Yeah.
Yes.
Somebody's going to get the bad end of the deal.
Somebody inevitably is going to get the bad end of that. If we help one side, we hurt the other. So ultimately, we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to manage that? Now, I've tried to give you a visual here to really wrap your brain around this concept of dual agency. So I've given you a visual of our firm. This is the firm, and these are the four brokers within our firm. If our seller on the left over here has hired Leslie, has she really hired Leslie, or has she hired Trav Talks? Trav Talks, which means she's also hired Travis and Dee and Seth, correct?
Yes.
Correct.
And if our buyer over here on the right has hired Seth to list his house because he's known Seth all his life, has he really hired Seth, or has he hired Trav Talks?
Trav Talks.
Which means he's also hired Travis and Leslie and Dee, correct?
Yes.
Correct.
Now, here's the thing. We know from a practical standpoint that Leslie will be the one working with this seller and that Seth will be the one working with this buyer. But can they act like they normally would in a transaction? In other words, can Leslie give that seller all the advice they would normally give them in a transaction?
No.
No.
No, because would that not be working against the best interest of Leslie's other client, the buyer? What do y'all think?
Working against.
So can she give advice to that seller?
I don't know.
They're working against each other.
No.
Well,
She
let me put it
can't.
to you this way. Do no harm. You cannot
Flow of agency.
any of your clients. Now, how's she going to handle that transaction? How's she going to handle that transaction with the seller without harming the buyer? What can she do?
Come on,
Now
think
give
logically.
advice.
Designated.
Well, can somebody else also represent the other party in the same firm? So say Seth will be for someone and Travis will be for someone else.
Designated.
Seth doesn't represent anybody. Who
And for anybody who knows the solution to this, just kind of hold off for just a second.
Seth,
Because this is an actual agency.
and see, y'all have to get past. See, this is the problem. You nod and you bobblehead when I say things, but you haven't gotten this yet. Nobody hired Seth, and nobody hired Leslie. Who did they hire? And so Leslie's not giving advice. What is giving advice to the seller?
The firm.
The firm. It doesn't matter who in the firm gives that advice. Who's giving advice?
The firm.
The firm.
The firm.
Seth's not giving advice. Who's giving advice?
The firm.
The firm.
Can the firm give advice in opposite directions to opposite people at the same time?
Yes.
Yes, you are a two-faced liar if you think that's true.
Why?
Ooh, that's blunt, ain't it? No, no, no,
And
no.
no. Perfect. I got it.
See, I have to scream it at you because it won't get in your brain. It won't. This has to get down to your soul. You have to understand how wrong this is for both of these clients, folks. This is a horrible result for both that seller and that buyer. This is the worst possible result for both that seller and that buyer, because the very place that the seller's looking for advice cannot give her advice. The very place that the buyer is looking for advice, guess what?
Cannot give advice.
Cannot give any advice.
Can anybody in that purple box give any advice to any of these parties in this transaction?
No.
No.
Nope.
I got it. That's horrible.
It's almost like, and this might not be the most complete example, but if we were going back to that rope pulling situation, this is when the same firm is in the middle and the rope is just connected. You can't even do anything with it.
That's
because
it. Drop the
when
rope.
you
So if this is such a bad idea, why does this even exist? And
Because
what-
it happened.
That's a question we have to get to. Why does it exist? It exists because there are times when it's inevitable. Here's the truth of the matter. When Leslie took this listing, did she consult with every member of her firm to find out if they might have a buyer interested, or did she just take the listing? What do y'all think?
She just took the list.
Listing.
She just took the listing, but remember, the seller didn't sign a listing agreement with Leslie. They signed a listing agreement with what?
Trav Talks.
With Trav Talks. When Seth signed a buyer agency agreement with this buyer, did Seth stop and talk to every agent in the firm and say, now, by the way, I have a buyer who I'm about to take on, but before I take them on, do you happen to have a property they're looking for? Or did Seth just sign a buyer agency agreement with that buyer? What do y'all think?
Just signed a buyer
Just
agent.
Signing.
We're already there. Whether we want to be or not, we're in the mess, folks. Because here's the truth. Didn't the seller already hire the firm?
Yep.
Yeah,
Didn't the buyer already hire the firm?
yeah.
Yep.
And now he wants to look at her house. He wants to, which we didn't know was going to happen. We couldn't have predicted it was going to happen. We had no idea it was going to happen, but here we are. And when he wants to see her house, and that's one of our listings, are we in dual agency, whether we want to be or not? What do y'all think?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's why it's a great question, Elizabeth, right? So this thing is not desirable. Certainly not. Listen, and this is my personal opinion. This situation is not desirable from anybody's perspective, not even the firms, because here's the truth. Do you think it is going to be hard, considering Seth has known this buyer all his life, for him not to give that buyer advice? Do you think that's going to be tough for Seth to remind himself continually to doing that transaction?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, would be horrible.
And do you think it's going to be hard for Leslie, with this seller as her next door neighbor and best friend? Do you think it's going to be hard for her to remind herself continually that she can't give advice in that transaction?
Yes.
Yes. And these people are going to be expecting it.
And they expect it and here's the thing. So I want you to think of it this way. Could the buyer have already made an offer on another property, maybe that didn't go through up to that point? Let's say Seth has already made 3 or 4 offers for this buyer. Is that possible?
Yeah.
Yes.
And all of those were listed by other firms. Did Seth give advice on all those other ones up to that point? When that buyer wanted to know, how much should I offer? How much should I give them as a deposit? How much do you think it's going to sell for? Was Seth more than happy to give that buyer advice on all those other offers?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sure. Is there going to be a very different experience, a very downgraded experience on this transaction for that buyer?
Yeah.
Yeah, because when
all those other homes were listed with another firm, I could give them advice, but this one is
Exactly.
now.
But on this one,
also-
when that buyer says, well, how much should I offer, Seth? What's Seth going to have to say to that buyer?
How much do you want to offer?
Whatever you think, because I can't what?
Advise
Can't tell you, can't advise you.
Because I also represent who?
the seller.
The seller.
Isn't that a tough position to find yourself in, folks?
Sounds like it should just be a for sale by owner and the buyer not have any representation.
Well, and that's basically what it comes down to at that point, Grant. That's pretty much what happens, because everybody in the purple box becomes a paper pusher. That's essentially what the role of the firm gets reduced to, which is just shuffling papers back and forth between the two. Because ultimately, now, not only do they have to make their own decisions, but they have to make them without the benefit of advice.
And Russell, thank you so much for mentioning that, because what I really wanted to get at here was that this is not transactional brokerage. This is fiduciary brokerage. We owe responsibility to both of these sides here. So how can you help one without harming the other?
Russell has asked a great question there that I'm building up to. Can we agree that this is a huge conflict of interest between what we would normally do in a fiduciary relationship of give advice, fight for our clients, do everything we can do to get the best possible results to our client, and now all of a sudden you're saying to these clients, I'm sorry, I can't help you, because if I was helping you, I'd be hurting my other client. Do you recognize that the conflict of interest is huge here? Is everybody with me on that?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And by the way, this is where the conflict of interest is even bigger, even though we try not to mix the idea of compensation with representation. The buyer and the seller are going to feel like they're getting shafted here because they're getting much less of a level of representation. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
What just happened to the compensation for the firm, though? Most likely.
It went up.
It went up. So now the firm is getting paid more money for
And
doing
giving less service.
less work. We have to recognize, folks, that that's a huge conflict of interest.
Now, why would the firm be getting more money?
So,
both sides.
so why would the firm be getting more money? Because there's nobody to split with. There's no outside firm to participate with here. Normally, as a listing firm, we would be open to sharing our compensation with somebody who brings us a buyer. But in
Okay.
this case, we don't have to share with an outside firm because there is no outside firm. It's all been done in-house. Does that make sense?
Got it.
to everybody?
Travis, can we take this to a grander level? Especially in North Carolina, like Keller Williams.
Are you insinuating my firm is not grand?
No, sir, not at all.
Go
But
ahead.
let's talk about a Keller Williams. And I remember you saying that Keller Williams is a corporation that has a bunch of firms underneath it, depending on what location you're in.
Yep.
Keller Williams of Valentine, Keller Williams Charlotte.
Yep. Two different firms.
Two different firms. But so isn't this sort of would this kind of be common when you talk about those huge firms? Because you don't know,
So,
you know,
but
you
let me establish. Those are two different firms. So
right.
It would only be dual agency if Keller Williams of Valentine was representing both sides at the same time.
But it's not uncommon.
What's that, Tosh?
That may not be uncommon, right?
Oh, there you go. There's the magic. How many agents are there at Keller Williams of Valentine?
Tons.
Hundreds, right?
Yeah.
So is this going to happen much more frequently in large firms with large numbers of agents?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, because the more people you have bringing buyers and sellers into the firm, the more likely it is that one of your buyers is going to be interested in one of your listings. No doubt. That's a wonderful question. Okay. So let me go to Russell's question. Russell's actually got a couple good questions in there, and I'm going to answer the first one first. Russell asks, do you tell these people that you're representing both of them and can't help either one? Well, look what we got right here in big letters on the slide. Dual agency can only be done when it is intentional, disclosed, and with what?
Permission.
Permission. And that permission must come from both parties. Intentional, disclosed, and with. And so what do we mean by intentional and disclosed? In other words, do you think when Seth takes this buyer into this property, before he ever even opens the door, does he need to have a discussion with this buyer and say, now you understand this is listed by our office, and so therefore I would not be able to give you any advice on this property? Does that conversation need to happen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. By the way, does it also need to happen with Leslie and that seller over there? Does Leslie need to say to the seller, somebody in my office has a buyer that they'd like to bring and look to show your property, but if that buyer were to be interested, you would need to be okay with us not giving you advice because we would be representing you and the buyer on that. Are you okay with that? Does that conversation need to happen?
Yes.
Yes.
It does. And it needs to happen with both sides. I cannot stress that enough. We need the permission of both parties because ultimately, and after all, they're both our clients. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
And here's the other thing that we need their permission for. We need their permission to give up stuff that they are entitled to. Remember all those old car duties that we owe to clients?
Yes.
Are some of those going to have to go out the window when we start representing both sides at the same time?
Yes.
Yes.
But as an example, normally, if I was an exclusive seller's agent, so I represent the seller, my firm represents the seller, and we're only on the seller side, and we find out that the buyer just won the lottery last week and has $47 billion sitting in the bank. If we're a seller's agent, what would we do with that information? If we're
You have to let the sellers know. You have to tell them.
We have to tell them, right?
Yes, because you
Because
owe
we
everything to him.
We represent them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If we're a dual agent, what would we do with that information?
You have to keep it quiet.
Quiet, because it's confidential information that belongs to our client. Well,
You
see,
just only advocate them.
we need permission to stop functioning as their advocate. And that's why we have to talk to them about this, right? And so Russell said, well, is advice only money or is it any advice? It's any advice. It's inspections. It's, well, do you think it's going to sell for full price? Or how much should I offer? Or, how quickly should we close? Anytime the word should How much should I do? What should I do? No. North Carolina specific, but it's going to be tested this way on the national exam. I would never teach anything in agency that's not North Carolina specific, because you need to know North Carolina specifics for agency. You don't need to screw this up. But this is also the way it's going to be tested on the national section of the exam.
Remember,
Okay.
we still owe them material facts in this situation.
Yes, we owe everybody material facts, whether they're clients or customers, and that doesn't change if we're in dual agency. But we do need this kind of informed consent. They have to give their permission. Now, Russell asked a question earlier that I want to revisit. And he asked it, to give you the context, he asked it when I was writing the dollar signs on here. And we were talking about how the firm would be making more money, but providing less of a service to each one of these parties. And Russell said, so as an agent, you want this. Here's the problem with that. We're never supposed to want what's best for us. We're supposed to always be looking out for what's best for our what?
Clients.
So in order to look out what's best for our clients, we should seek to avoid dual agency at all costs. It should really only be done when it's unavoidable, because there are going to be very big conflicts of interest that we cannot get past. We have to limit some of those duties that come from agency. Like, we will be neutral. We don't owe them reasonable skill. That's the R in old car. We no longer owe them reasonable skill. We're not supposed to be good at our jobs anymore. Folks, I'm gonna tell you, it's hard for me not to be good at my job. I'm kidding. But it is. It's hard not to give advice. How many of you think of yourself as like an expert at something? Maybe you're an expert baker. Maybe you're an expert like painter. But you're just good at something. Have you ever tried to watch somebody who's messing that thing up without saying anything?
Horrible. You have to stay.
And you know what they're doing wrong. And you have to watch them do it over and over and over wrong without saying. Do you know how hard that is?
Yes.
It is agonizing to watch people go through it. And I'll tell you another thing that's super frustrating and agonizing about dual agency. What if you know that both of them are being stubborn, that with a decent amount of advice, you could probably get them to be under contract, but right now it's not going anywhere. You know, you got a buyer who's offering $400,000 and a seller who's dug in at $450,000 and nothing's happening. And you want to say to the buyer, listen, if you came up to like $410,000, they would probably come down and meet you somewhere in the middle. Can you say that if you're in dual agency?
No.
It is super frustrating to find yourself in that situation, because the truth is, if you do what's right as a dual agent, you're going to be really horrible at being an agent in that transaction, because it will be a transaction where y'all want to hear something funny. I probably shouldn't tell you this, but you want to hear something funny? When the real estate commission hears disciplinary cases where agents are accused of violating dual agency rules, you know, of like they've done the wrong thing in a dual agency transaction, they always bring in the buyer and the seller and interview them. And they always ask a very simple question. Well, would you recommend Patty? Did she do a good job for you? And here's what a lot of those sellers will say, or buyers will say, oh my God, she was awesome. She was fantastic. Because remember, they have voluntarily come. They are happy to try to help Patty out in front of the real estate commission. Oh yes, I would recommend Patty. She was incredible. So she was very helpful for you in the transaction, huh? Oh God, we couldn't have done it without her. Did she give good advice? The best advice. Everything she told me to do during the transaction, I did, and it all worked out great. And it was amazing. Thank you so much for coming in, Mr. Seller. And then when they leave the room, they look at Patty and they say, you can leave that license on the table over there when you leave. Because if that's dual agency, what should the seller have said when they said, would you recommend Patty in the transaction? What should the seller's response have been?
Hell no,
No,
I wouldn't.
she was
She
crap.
didn't tell me nothing.
No advice.
They'd be like, oh my God, was Patty in the transaction? I don't remember, honey. Was she there? Like, she kind of just disappeared. I know she got paid a bunch of money, but I didn't really see her. I mean, every time we needed something, she was telling us how she couldn't answer this, she couldn't answer that. And the real estate commission would look at them and say, thank you. And then when they left the room, they'd look at Patty and they go, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Because as weird as that sounds, folks, that's the right way to do it when you're in what?
Dual agency.
Dual agency.
Dual agency.
That's
Right?
how you've done your job in a dual agency situation. You know, Russell had asked, can the client cancel or void the contract to find a new agent or firm, or do they have to go all the way through?
Well, so it's a reasonable question that people ask often, because I understand you're trying to problem solve it. You're trying to think, okay, well, what if I find myself, so I'll back up to the pictures because I think it helps to visualize the situation. What if this buyer says, you know what, I like you, Seth, but I really need advice. So I want to go work with another firm. That seems like a reasonable solution, correct? Everybody with me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Here's the problem though. I want to point something out to you. This buyer has been working with Seth for weeks. This buyer has shared all their personal confidential information with Seth for weeks, which was all fine because Seth was their agent and we keep our clients' information confidential, correct?
Mhm.
Correct.
If this buyer leaves and goes to another firm, if we sever that relationship right there, if we just boom, that relationship is severed, is the information suddenly forgotten by Seth, or now is Seth in possession of a bunch of personal confidential information about somebody he no longer represents?
Yes, he
So
has all the
later-
information.
And now, who does Seth represent?
Seller.
Seller.
So it's
So
not
that's
convenient
not
for
a-
the seller.
That's not a good
for the
idea
buyer.
for that client either. Does that help when you see it that way?
Mhm.
You know, and so the truth is they're stuck. Everybody's stuck when this happens. And all we can do is make the best of it. That's it from this point forward. Now, I will say this. Not every firm practices dual agency. There is no requirement that every firm offer every type of agency. The broker in charge gets to decide what types of agency the firm offers. Some firms don't offer dual agency. Some do, most do, some don't. And so each firm has to make its own decision about whether or not they want to do this, okay? And I saw the question come up, why would somebody do this? And Seth gave the best possible answer. So let me go back and erase this here. Why would our buyer over here do this? Why would our seller here agree to this? Well, I'll tell you why the buyer would agree to it. They didn't know when they signed that buyer agency agreement that their dream house was going to be listed by Trav Talks. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
They've already signed the agreement. And now here we are, their dream house is listed by Trav Talks. And here's the truth from the other perspective. When the seller listed it with Trav Talks, they had no idea that their perfect buyer was also going to be represented by what?
Trav
By
Talks.
Trav Talks. So now I want to take that one step further, and I want you to really pay attention to this, because understanding this will go a long way to helping you understand dual agency and why people agree to it. Seth's going to explain all of this to this buyer before he shows the property. He's going to say to the buyer, now, I know I've given you advice on all these other properties before, but I can't give you advice on this one. I wouldn't be able to, I mean, I'd be able to just give you factual answers, nothing advice related. Are you okay with that? And the buyer says, well, no, I'm not okay with that. Is that a reasonable response from the buyer?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Here's Seth's response. Y'all listening to me? Y'all ready?
Yep.
Then you can't see the house, because you're not allowed to look at it without me, because we represent you. And I'm not allowed to show it to you and give advice because I also represent them. So if you're not okay with looking at it without my advice, you can't see it all.
That's ridiculous.
So
why wouldn't I go down the street and have another broker show me the house?
well, you
Because
could.
you signed a contract.
You signed, number one, you signed an agency agreement, but also you'd have to be worried about whatever information you had given to that firm because they possess it now and they have to use it against you if they no longer represent you.
Aha.
It is a tough position that everybody finds themselves in at this juncture, but it's here and we have to deal with it.
So unfair.
It is. It's just tough. It is tough. And so ultimately the buyer will probably agree to the dual agency because what do they really want to not miss out on?
Their dream home,
The
their
property.
dream house.
And if you flip it around from the seller's perspective, Leslie's having the same conversation with the seller. Now, we have a buyer who'd like to look at your property. They're really interested, but it is one of my firm's buyers. So if they were to make an offer, if they were to look at it, I wouldn't be able to give you any advice. Well, the seller could say, no, I'm not okay with that. And what would Leslie have to say to the seller? Then we won't let the buyer what?
See the house.
We won't bring them to see the property. We can't bring them to see the property because the only way we can bring them to see the property is if you're okay with the dual agency.
So is Seth just not, does Seth just not research any of his in-house properties?
Well, maybe he did and maybe he didn't. Maybe the listing came on the market after he already had been hired by this buyer. Remember, he's been working with this buyer for weeks, right? And all of a sudden, this is a new listing that Leslie just took. And as soon as it pops, the buyer's like, oh, I want to see that one. So it's hard to anticipate that this happens.
So I think in California, I don't mean to do this, but I think in California, this is not the issue. Everybody represents their own side.
This is unique to us. Exactly.
Of course, it's all that humidity. Right.
Exactly. That's it. That's it. How are we feeling about dual agency? Now, I don't mean how are you feeling about do you like it or not, but are we starting to get some understanding here of what dual agency is and how it functions? Does that make sense for everybody so far? Okay, good. Now, in North Carolina, you will be asked on the North Carolina specific section of the test, when do we need to get the dual agency permission put into writing? The truth is that we can get oral permission, oral authorization for dual agency from both the seller and the buyer for a limited amount of time. Everybody okay with that statement? Remember, we got to go back to the seller who's already our client. We got to go back to the buyer who's already our client and ask them, are they okay with this dual agency stuff? Because now we're in it. And the Real Estate Commission says that we can have that as a verbal conversation, and we can even get verbal permission under one very narrow circumstance. This is going to show up as a test question on the state section for sure. If the buyer has a verbal or oral buyer agency agreement. So if the buyer has a verbal or oral, means the same thing, buyer agency agreement, then you only need what kind of permission for the dual agency? Verbal. Now, this is where you're going to go off the reservation. I want you to pay attention to me here. Whatever permission you need from the buyer, you need the same permission from the seller. So if you have a verbal buyer agency agreement, what kind of permission do you need from both the buyer and the seller for dual agency in that transaction?
Verbal.
Verbal. I'm going to ask it again so you can get it in your brain. If you have a verbal buyer agency agreement at that point in time with that buyer, remember how we said you could have a verbal buyer agency agreement for a certain period of time?
Mm-hmm.
When do we have to put the buyer agency agreement into writing?
When you make an offer.
Where it's an offer.
Right? So if we're still operating with a verbal buyer agency agreement, then we can get what kind of permission to move forward with dual agency from both buyer and seller?
Verbal.
Verbal. Match them up. If we have a verbal buyer agency agreement, then we can get verbal permission for dual agency from both the buyer and the seller. However, if we have a written agency agreement with that buyer, then we need what kind of permission from both the buyer and the seller to move forward with dual agency in that transaction?
Written.
Written permission.
Do not make it harder than it is.
Right.
It is at the time of showing, what kind of agreement does the buyer have with their broker, their agent?
Verbal.
Verbal.
Well, we don't know.
Well,
He's saying that's what's going to determine the answer. If it is verbal.
But if it was, it'd
then
be
what
verbal
kind of
permission.
you would need verbal permission for dual agency. If it was written, so now let's see if you're paying attention here. We'll back up to this picture. So you got the visual to look at while we're talking about this, okay? Seller Sarah has signed an exclusive listing agreement with Leslie of Trav Talks Real Estate on her property in Garner. Buyer Bill, who's represented by Seth of Trav Talks Real Estate, has taken an interest in the property. Bill has been working with Seth as his buyer's agent for several months, and Seth has written 3 offers which have not been successful on Bill's behalf. Everybody with me so far?
Yep.
Okay, I'm gonna give it to you again up to this point. Seller Sarah has signed a written listing agreement with Leslie of Trav Talks Real Estate. Buyer Bill has been working for the last 3 months with Seth as his buyer's agent of Trav Talks Real Estate. And Seth has already written and presented 3 offers on behalf of Bill, which have not been successful. Everybody with me on where we are so far? Bill would like to see Sarah's home. It meets all of his criteria, and he's expressed to Seth that he would like to take a look at the property. Seth recognizes that it is one of his office's listings and knows that he needs permission for dual agency. What type of permission do we need for this showing to continue from both the buyer and the seller?
At least
Written.
At least
Either.
verbal. Or
Verbal.
At least.
Written.
It's either,
I'm
right?
thinking, because I didn't hear the verbal or the written,
I
I'm
didn't
thinking
either.
because I already
yes,
submitted
you did.
offers.
You submitted
The
offers.
first thing was
Yes,
written.
you did.
He's already
Yes, you
submitted.
did. I just didn't say it. I just didn't say it directly. What did I say? He's already submitted on behalf of that buyer.
Offer.
Reading
You
agreement.
should offer. So you
Offers.
should have a contract.
If he's already
haven't been
submitted-
accepted.
If he's already submitted offers, what kind of buyer agency agreement do we have?
Reading.
Written buyer agency agreement, and now he wants to see that dual agency listing. So what kind of permission do we need from both the buyer and the seller?
Reading.
Written.
Written permission. See, that's tying all the pieces together of saying, okay, well, I know if he wrote offers, he must have a written buyer agency agreement. And if he's got a written buyer agency agreement, then we need written permission from the buyer and the seller. Is everybody following how that follows through?
Yes.
Okay.
Travis,
Yes.
for example, if the first one who get into the game, let's call it like that, it has a reading or verbal, that depends on the next one what they needs to have. If the first one has a reading, then the second one needs to have a reading in the
Not
dual.
necessarily, Marcia. It's a
No?
great question. Marcia asked a great question, and the answer is not necessarily. It's what does the buyer have? And let me tell you why. Let me go back to our picture here. Is it possible? Obviously, the seller has a written agency agreement, correct? Because that's the only type we have for sellers. Does that make sense to everybody? So let's say that the seller signed a written listing agreement And let's say the seller said no dual agency in writing on their listing agreement. They wrote no dual agency in writing on their listing agreement. Everybody with me?
Yes.
Okay. Buyer Bill, who's also represented by the firm, but has a verbal buyer agency agreement, wants to see Sarah's property. What kind of permission do we need from the buyer and the seller for dual agency in this transaction?
Written.
Verbal.
Verbal. Apply the rule. Stop answering with your gut. That's gas from lunch. It's not an answer. Answer with the rule. And what does the rule say? Look at what kind of buyer agency agreement we have. It doesn't matter that the seller has a written listing agreement that says no dual agency. What does the rule say we're going to look to? What kind of buyer agency?
Okay.
We have?
Even if the seller before that showing had written on there, I don't want dual agency, we can revisit it.
That's right.
Hey, I know you said this, but what do you think about it now?
We'll go back to Sarah and say, what do you think about me now? You know, we
haven't had anybody buy it in 4 months.
The buyer is here and they want to look at it. Are you okay with that? And if Sarah says okay verbally, we're good to go because Buyer Bill has a verbal buyer agency agreement. Is everybody?
Now that's just for the showing.
Yes.
It's completely tied to the buyer agency agreement. The type of permission we need has nothing to do with the listing side and everything to do with the buyer side. That's a tough rule for people to get because they want to make it more complex than it is. It's literally always going to be, what kind of buyer agency agreement do we have? And that's the answer. Verbal buyer agency, what kind of permission do we need?
Verbal.
No matter what else they tell you. I don't care if they tell you that the seller tattooed the listing agreement on their arm that says no dual agency. It doesn't matter. You only need verbal permission because you have a verbal buyer agency agreement.
Yes, and that is really key. They're going to tell you so many things that throw you off. Just see what the buyer has. That's all you got to do. No matter what.
So, somebody sent me a private question, which is a good one, I think, to read to everybody. It says, if you're a listing agent and you have an open house and a buyer comes in who does not have an agency agreement with any firm, and they ask you to be their agent. Well, first of all, would that be dual agency if they ask you to be their agent and you're the listing agent holding the open house? You're the listing agent, you're holding the open house. They come in, they say, I want you to represent me. Would that be dual agency?
Yes.
It would be. Yes. Clearly it would be. Yes. Okay. The question said, though, what if I refer them to somebody else in my office? Would that still be dual agency? What's the answer?
Yes.
Yes, that would still be dual agency. We have not escaped dual agency by referring them to someone else in our office. If we wanted to escape dual agency with that buyer, if we're holding the open house, everybody with me?
Yeah.
Yes.
If we're holding the open house, there's 2 ways to avoid dual agency in that transaction. 2 ways. One of them much easier than the other.
Yeah, one of them is to refer them to a different office location, an agent in a different office location.
That's the more complex one, right? The more
Don't buy the house.
The more complex one is refer them to another office to represent them in the transaction. Now, keep in mind, could you negotiate a referral fee back from that other office for basically putting them a buyer on a silver platter? Could you do that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's the more complex one. Now that's going to make sure that's going to provide the buyer with representation from another office, and it takes away the whole concern for dual agency. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
There's another possible method, and it's actually the more straightforward. It's the easier one, and it's the one you hope happens. Just say to the buyer, no, I can't represent you because I already represent the seller. Because here's what you need to remember. Not representing the buyer doesn't mean you can't help them continue in the transaction. It just means you're not on their team. Could I, as the listing agent, still work with that buyer in putting together an offer on that property without being hired by that buyer to represent them. Could I do that?
Yes.
Yes. Who would I be representing in that transaction?
The seller.
Just the seller. Folks, that right there is the dream transaction for both you and your client. Who's your client?
The seller.
The seller.
Isn't the best possible buyer from the seller's perspective a buyer who has no representation at all?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And best possible outcome from your perspective. Who you splitting the money with?
Yourself.
Nobody, right? You're keeping it all. So that's the other possible option. Just remind that buyer you represent the seller. Because here's the thing. Here's what my experience has been in the business. 9 times out of 10, when a buyer approaches me about one of my listings, they're not interested in me. They're not interested in representation. What are they interested in?
The house.
The house.
Property. I can help them with the property without representing them, folks. I don't need to represent them to help them navigate that process.
So then you just don't get an agreement.
That's right. They don't sign a buyer agency agreement.
Oh, that's cool. Okay.
Good. And in fact, I don't need to sign any agreement at that point in time because I already have an agreement with who?
The seller.
With the seller. I've already got all the agreements I need. All we need is write an offer. Let's go, baby. We're ready.
Piece of cake.
So Patty said, can I say what I told him again? I said, I can't represent you because I already represent the seller. And this would be my honest response, by the way, because I don't do dual agency in my firm. We don't practice dual agency. We're a small enough firm. It doesn't impact us very much. I don't believe in it. So my choice, we don't do it. Here would be my honest answer to that buyer. We don't represent both parties in the same transaction because I don't believe that's fair. We already represent the seller in this transaction. I am more than happy to help you make an offer if that's what you'd like to do. But just please understand, I can't give you advice because I wouldn't be your agent and I would be working for the seller. Do you want to make an offer? And what do you think? What do you think 99 buyers out of 100 who are really interested in the property will say when you tell them that?
Yes.
Sure. Yeah, let's make an offer. Yeah. And meanwhile, I'm doing a happy dance.
But down the road, when there is 4 feet of water in the basement and this buyer you're helping comes to you and says, what do I do about this? You just raise your arms and go, I don't know.
Hey, I represent the seller. I work for the seller. I can't give you advice.
Oh, I hate this. I just hate this.
I know it. Isn't that fun? Isn't it nice? Okay. How are we feeling about this dual agency stuff and the conflicts presented here? We okay so far?
Not quite. What my other colleague said, she said, but you can't tell them if there's water flooding in the basement. So
I said, no, she said the buyer said, what should they do about the water in the basement? We would certainly be obligated to tell them about the water in the basement as a material fact, but it's a different question to say, what should they do about it? That's advice.
Right. Okay. I'm sorry.
But yeah, no, I'm glad you asked. I want to make sure you get those clarified in your brain because it's a good thing that perked your ears up. You're like, wait a minute, I thought I was supposed to tell them. And you are supposed to tell them, just don't give them advice about, there's a big difference between telling a buyer there's water and saying to the buyer, and I think you should do this about the water. When you're not their agent, you only give them the first part because they're your customer.
Remember, they asked the question with the word should, and that's when you're giving advice.
That's it. And that has been one of the greatest ways to sort of discipline myself over the years. I just always remind myself, anytime somebody uses the word should or would in a question, they're asking for my advice. What would you do? What should I do? Those 2 words, they tell you what they're asking you. They're asking for your advice. Okay. What do you think? That's another one. All right. So when we talk about getting permission for dual agency in writing, I just want to show you sort of what that looks like on a piece of paper. These are the authorizations that show up on either the buyer agency agreement. This one up here at the top, this is the buyer agency. I'm going to change the pen color. This is buyer agency. And this one down here is a listing agreement. But this is an example of the kind of language that we put in our written agency agreements to get their permission. It's not like a big, long question. It basically says, initial one, notice this, initial only one. So if the buyer was going to authorize us to act as a dual agent, we would get them to initial on that line right there. But if the buyer didn't and they wanted no dual agency, they would initial on that line. Everybody, that okay for everybody?
Mhm.
Okay. So that's an example of how we get the permission for dual agency in writing. And we do have to eventually get it in writing once we go to a written buyer agency agreement. So let's say let me point this out, because I think sometimes people don't make this connection. Let's say when we showed the property to the buyer, we had a verbal buyer agency agreement. So most likely, what kind of permission did we get for the dual agency if we had a verbal buyer agency agreement?
The same verbal.
We got verbal. Now the buyer wants to make an offer. Are we going to have to get our permission for dual agency changed to writing now that we're doing a written
Yes.
buyer agency agreement?
Yes.
Yeah. Right? So eventually,
Present an offer.
if we present an offer, we need written permission for dual agency if we get to that point, for sure. But look at this question. Mary has hired Oak Grove Real Estate LLC to list her home for sale, and she's working with listing agent Ariana. Ariana has placed the home on the market and was contacted by Donald of Oak Grove Real Estate LLC, who has a buyer client that has interest in Mary's home. Which of the following statements is correct? And this is what you're going to see. This is what you're going to be faced with. So first of all, let's unpack this and talk about the agency here. Mary has hired Oak Grove Real Estate to list her home. Okay. And they've been contacted by Donald, who's also of Oak Grove Real Estate LLC, who has a buyer client. What kind of agency is Oak Grove Real Estate LLC participating in here, folks?
A dual agency.
This is dual agency because it makes it clear that Oak Grove Real Estate has been hired by both this buyer and this seller in this transaction. Is everybody okay on that? Okay. So they've been hired by both. Number one, Mary should be told why the buyer is relocating to the area. Do you think Mary, who is one of the two parties, should be given confidential information about the other party? What do y'all think?
No.
No, that's a no. Okay. Number two, the buyer client should expect Donald to inform them of Mary's need to sell the quickly property. So sell the property quickly. What do y'all think?
No. Confidential information.
Nope. Ariana should refuse. Ariana's the one working with the seller. Ariana should refuse to advise Mary on an appropriate response to the buyer's offer. Should Ariana refuse to advise her client?
Yep. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, because it's dual agency.
Of what?
Dual agency.
Advice.
Advice. Dual agency. Okay. So that one looks good to me. But let's check number 4 just to be sure. Donald will be expected to recommend to the buyer that they should have an inspection. Could we stop right there at the word recommend?
Yep.
Yes.
Because if we're in dual agency, that's a no, right?
Right.
Right. So this is number 3. Number 3.
William has a question.
William, you had a question?
Yeah, if I had the buyer first, and I've been working with a buyer, I have the written agency agreement, why does the buyer's rights dissolve? Because 3 months down the line, somebody in my office got a listing. Why does that buyer now not important?
It's not true at all. It's the buyer's choice. The buyer can keep all of their rights. They just don't have to look at this one property.
That's the thing. It's got to be on the one property that makes it dual agency.
It's not dual agency for every property all of a sudden. It's dual agency for that one listing. So if the buyer is really insistent on still wanting representation, they can just decide not to look at that one property.
Okay.
Yeah, it's all about that one individual property. Okay. Look at this one. It says Billie Jean's a provisional broker affiliated with Sell for More Realty, located in Burlington. Sell for More as a firm does not offer any form of buyer agency. Billie Jean holds an open house at one of the office listings, and buyer Latrice shows up, who does not have an agent, and asked Billie Jean if she would assist Latrice in making an offer to purchase the property. Billie Jean does so. What type of agency relationship is this?
Exclusive
seller.
We don't do transactional brokerage in North Carolina, and I see a North Carolina flag over there.
So we can scratch that immediately.
Dual
And
agency.
it's not dual
Why not?
Why is it not
Exclusive
dual?
seller.
It
because
is.
we don't have an agreement with the buyer.
And why do we know they don't have an agreement with the buyer? I love it. Keep going. Why do we know they don't have an agreement with the buyer?
All they want to do is
The firm doesn't offer it.
There we go.
Folks, you can't represent the buyer as a dual agent if you don't offer what kind of agency as a firm? Buyer agency.
Buyer agency.
If the firm doesn't represent buyers, then there's no way the firm's ever going to find itself in dual agency. This is a firm that only represents who?
Sellers.
Sellers. What's the answer to this question?
Exclusive
seller agency.
That's exclusive seller agency. And they
Now let's
deliberately
take a
told
look
you that.
at this line right here. Buyer Latrice shows up and says and asks if Billie Jean can assist Latrice with making an offer. Keyword there, assist. What are we doing? We're just giving honesty and fairness. We're not giving advice. We're just helping. We're working with.
Advice. Exactly.
We're not working for.
Right. Yeah, I mean, think about customers. We help customers. That's what we do. We assist customers, but we do not work for them. Right? That's a different thing. And so
at Best Buy, when I work for the Best Buy counter, I work for Best Buy, but when the sellers come through, of course I'm going to help them make their payment and, you know, write a check or something.
Exactly. Well, you probably got them to write a check to you personally, but that's a different story.
Well,
now, before I go any further, I have a question. Have we presented a really ugly scenario in dual agency? Have we thoroughly convinced you that dual agency is ugly from both the perspective of the buyer and the seller?
Yep.
I don't want to do that.
Good. Because there is a better way that is allowed in North Carolina. But you can't understand. People always say, why don't you go to this one first? Because you'd never understand dual agency if I started with this one. You remember all those questions you asked about why couldn't Leslie represent the seller while Seth represents the buyer? You remember those?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're about to figure out a way for that to happen. That is called designated agency or designated dual agency. Now, it is still dual agency because the firm still represents both the buyer and the seller. But what if I told you there was a way to put Leslie in one bubble and Seth in another bubble and have them individually represent those two people? Have Leslie represent. What's that?
That could be a great idea.
That's a great idea, and that is very much possible in designated agency. So when a firm operates as a designated agent, the offices have been hired by both, still dual agency, okay? But what the firm is going to do, and usually when I say the firm, that usually means the broker in charge would be making this decision. What the broker in charge is going to do is assign certain people from the firm to be on the buyer's team and certain people from the firm to be on the seller's team. The BIC gets to make the choice. Here's the nice thing about that. Once they are put on a team, they can give their team, what's our favorite thing?
Advice.
Advice. Once you've been designated to a team, I think Elizabeth's going to like this one a lot better, I think. Once you've been designated to one team or the other, you are allowed to give advice within the transaction. And the huge benefit of this is that the clients, both of them, are much more going to feel like they're getting what they paid for, because they are getting what they paid for in a much greater manner. Now, I'm gonna go to a picture here because I want you to see same pictures. Everybody recognize this is the same picture we looked at before, right?
Mhm.
Except before you had a big purple box around the whole firm because each client was hiring the whole firm and everybody in the firm owed each client all the same duties. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
That's true dual agency. If the firm chooses to operate as a designated agent, well, you still have a listing agreement being signed here between the seller and the firm. You still have a buyer agency agreement being signed between the buyer and the firm. But what the firm is now able to do is say, okay, Seth and Travis are going to represent the buyer in this transaction. Does it have to be Seth and Travis? No. Could it just be Seth? What do y'all think?
Yes.
Yeah. Could it just be Travis?
Yes.
Yes. Whose choice is that?
The
broker in charge. Could it be 2 or 3 or 1 or whatever number the BIC wants to put in that bubble?
Yes.
Okay. Here's the thing. Respect the bubble. Can Travis now give advice in the transaction?
No.
Yes.
Yes.
Look at the bubble.
Yeah, yes.
Look at the
Yes,
bubble.
yes.
Can Travis give advice?
Yes.
But only to which party?
The buyer. Buyer.
Only to the buyer.
The buyer team.
Can Leslie now give advice?
Yes.
Yes, but only to
The seller.
the seller. Can Dee give advice?
Oh, she's partially in there.
He's out of the bubble.
No.
No, because she's not in either bubble. So she's still a what?
Dual agent.
She's a dual agent. She represents both of them, so she can't give either one of them advice. But the ones who have been placed in these bubbles can give all the advice they normally would in any other transaction. Talk to me.
Yeah. I'm loving that. I'm loving it.
Now, is this going to be a much happier outcome for probably the buyer and seller? Are they going to be much more pleased with the level of service and just care they get in this transaction as a result of this?
Of course. Yes.
Yes.
Do you need
It's very.
Do you need
What
permission?
was that?
Do you need permission?
We do need permission. We still need written permission. We still go through the same permission process because it is still dual agency. And so we still need permission for it. But all we're doing here is creating these two, bubbles, these two teams within the firm. Now there's some.
I just really wanted to emphasize on the fact that everybody outside of those bubbles are actually still going to be dual agents. If you're not in the bubble, you're a dual. If you're in the bubble, you're a designated.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Now, one thing I do want to point out to you is that designated agency is still dual agency. So it doesn't eliminate that. Are there still going to be people in the firm? In our case, in this picture, D is the one. But are there still going to be people in the firm who have this conflicted, I can't give anybody advice?
Yes.
Yes. But here's the real truth of the matter. Was Dee likely to ever be involved in this transaction anyway? Was she likely to ever talk to either the buyer or the seller, given what we know about the transaction?
No.
No. So it really doesn't make any difference that she's a dual agent, because quite honestly, she doesn't give a crap about this transaction. She doesn't even probably know what's going on. It's just other people in her firm. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Right? Now, the thing we have to be very careful about here, and this is when we get into the dynamics of the bubble, so to speak. Look at this note right here. It says never share personal information of one bubble with anybody.
Another bubble.
Anybody in the other bubble, right? You got to think, this is when teaching during COVID is actually a good thing. These are like quarantine bubbles. The bubbles may not cross. No information can leak out of either bubble and get into the other bubble. Does that make sense for everybody? So the only way we can really do that is by first asking, do you think Travis is going to have a conversation with Leslie before the BIC can say, Leslie, you're in this bubble with the seller. Do you think we need to have a conversation with Leslie and make sure she doesn't know anything about our friend, the buyer over here? What do y'all think?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Right. We do. I'd have to say to Leslie, do you know anything about the buyer that would harm them in the transaction? And most likely, what's Leslie going to say?
No.
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 No. Good. Then you're in the bubble with the seller. You be the seller's agent. You be the seller's designated agent. You take care of the seller. You give the seller advice. Everybody good with me on that?
Yeah.
And then I would go to Seth and I would say, Seth, do you know anything at all about who?
The seller.
The
The
seller.
seller, because I'm putting Seth in the bubble with the buyer. So I need to make sure he doesn't know anything about who?
The seller.
The seller, the other side. As I said, do you know anything at all that would harm the seller? He says, nope, never heard of them. And I'm going to say, good. I'm going to put you in the bubble with the buyer over here. But I'm going to tell you what, Leslie is a nasty negotiator. I feel like you're going to need some help on this thing. So I'm going to put myself in the bubble with you. Can I do that as the broker in charge?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. The BIC folks can put any mixture of people they want in their firm in these bubbles. It doesn't matter that Leslie is under my supervision. Can I put myself in a bubble against her in this transaction?
Yes.
Yes.
No,
I can.
you can?
Yes.
I thought you couldn't if she was a provisional.
Well, I didn't say anything about that, and she's not a provisional broker.
I mean, non-provisional.
Then don't make it more complex than it is. Can the BIC put anybody they want to in these bubbles, folks?
Yes.
Yes. Is there maybe a narrow exception to that? Yes, but you got to learn the rule before you can learn the exception. And the rule is the BIC can put anybody. Could I put 10 people in one bubble and one in the other?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Could I put a provisional in one bubble and a non-provisional in the other?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Could I put,
They have to be put at the same time?
I'm sorry,
They all have to be put in the bubble at the same time, or can people join later, or?
they could join later. I could designate them later. If Leslie comes to me and says she needs help, could I make this bubble bigger and bring D into the bubble with Leslie there?
So long as D doesn't know any info, but yes.
As long as she doesn't know anything about the other bubble, yeah, for sure. We can rope people in at any time. Okay. Now, to William's point, there is one exception to the we can put anybody in the bubbles rule. Only one. And it has to do with the BIC themselves. I want to be clear.
Provisional.
The BIC can be in a bubble. The BIC can work. I can work against Seth. I could be a designated agent on one side with Seth, a designated agent on the other side. I could be a designated agent on one side with Leslie on the other side. Matter of fact, I could designate myself against everybody in my firm. But there's one person who I don't supervise any of that if I did supervise, I couldn't put myself against. I could put myself in a bubble with them, but I couldn't put myself in a bubble against them. What's the one person you think the real estate commission would
Provisional.
say?
Provisional, because they had to be in supervision.
Because I'm supervising that provisional broker. How in the world could I put myself against them if I'm supposed to be what?
Supervising.
Helping,
Supervising everything they do. Now, I want to be clear. Can I put a provision? If I brought one of you into my firm, could I designate you in one bubble and Leslie, who is non-provisional and who is a broker in charge, but not broker in charge of our firm? Could I put her in one bubble and you as a provisional in the other bubble?
Yes. Yes, if she doesn't
Because
supervise.
she's not your broker in charge. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Could I put you plus Seth in one bubble and Leslie in another bubble?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Could I put you plus me in a bubble and everybody else in the firm in the other bubble?
Yes.
Yes. Could I put you in a bubble with everybody else in the firm and me in a bubble by myself on the other side?
No.
No. No.
No, no way can I put the BIC of that firm in one bubble and a provisional under their supervision in another. That's the only one that doesn't work. Are we all good on that?
Yeah.
We
A
got
quick
it.
question. If we, if since dual agency is so crazy, why don't we just ask the seller when we're listing, do you mind designating?
It's a great question. It is a fantastic question. And I will tell you, there are quite a lot of people in North Carolina, and I am one of them, who thinks that we need to flip the way we think about dual agency. There are states out there who only consider it dual agency when it's one agent, one person within the firm representing both sides. That's not how we define dual agency, but there are states that do that. In those states, they do designated agency in every other situation. So designated agency is like what they fall back to. If it's two different brokers within the firm, then that's automatically designated agency. There is a big push for that to be the case in North Carolina. But why do we not do it why do we not ask the question that, as you just put it there, we're not allowed to ask the question that way? And here's why. Because right now, designated agency in North Carolina is considered a subset of dual agency. In other words, look at the form here and look at the authorization. They have to choose one of these two right here first. Does everybody see that where it says initial only one? Either the buyer authorizes dual agency or the buyer does not authorize dual agency. Does everybody see that? Those two lines right there. So William, here's what's going to happen. Your buyer says, no, I don't agree to dual agency, and the initial right here, you're not allowed to talk to them about the next line. You're never allowed to mention this to them anymore.
Oh, wow.
Because the only way you can mention that one is if they initialed this line up here. If they authorize dual agency, then you can talk to them and see if you can get their permission for designated agency. So you got to get permission for dual agency first, and then you can get permission for designated. So let me ask this in another way. Can somebody give permission for only dual but not designated? Is that possible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Can somebody give permission for only designated but not dual?
No.
No. Good.
It takes some real good explanation and teaching to walk them through this section of the agreement, right?
Yes.
I mean, it took you 40 minutes to explain it to us.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. So someone sent me a private question that said, you're called a broker in charge if you're supervising a provisional broker. The better, that's a yes. Yes, that would be a BIC, but that's not the best definition of a BIC. By far, the best definition of a broker in charge is a broker who is supervising any broker, whether they be provisional or not, including themselves. If they have told the real estate commission, I'm supervising someone, then they are a broker in charge. That is the best possible definition of a broker in charge. It's any broker in North Carolina who's taken responsibility for supervising either themselves or other people. There's a difference between supervising yourself and being unsupervised. You can operate either way in North Carolina. You can operate unsupervised, no BIC, or you can operate with you as your own BIC. And we'll talk about the difference between those two as we go through license law, but those are two different things as well.
Can you only have one in an office that's supervising everybody, or do you have multiple that can supervise?
You can only have one broker in charge per location. A broker in charge supervises a location. However, if you have multiple companies in the same location, each one of those companies could have a separate broker in charge.
Okay.
So one company at one location is one broker in charge. But if you have like 3 LLCs operating out of the same address, you could potentially have 3 different brokers in charge of those 3 different LLCs.
So in this last example, when you had provisional versus provisional in the designated agency, you would be over both of them.
One BIC, right? Because you're all dual agency is always one BIC. That is the definition of dual agency. That is everybody in the transaction is under the services of that one broker in charge.
Okay.
Okay. We do need to tell the buyer and the seller that we're going to do designated agency. We need their permission, like we said, and make sure we know who. Make sure you tell them who is working against them in the transaction, because remember now somebody in the firm is working against them and they need to know who that is. It is still dual agency. It doesn't eliminate the need for talking about dual agency because it is still dual agency. So we have to make sure that we recognize that in North Carolina. There is a difference, and we're going to talk about this a lot more next week when we get into agency contracts, but there is a big difference in being hired in writing versus being hired orally. Now, we know from our conversations already that certain agreements, listing agreements, are not allowed to exist verbally, orally. But are there some agency agreements that can exist verbally? What do y'all think? Can some agency agreements be verbal?
Yes, a buyer's agency.
Yeah.
Buyer agency can. Yes, buyer agency can for a limited amount of time. Good. Last thing we want to talk about today, and we may not get quite through this, and I'm sure we will revisit it next week, but I think it's a topic I want to make sure we talk about this week before you get your break for the weekend, which is telling people who we work for. Telling them who we work for is really important. Letting people know who we represent in a transaction. Now that we've gone through all these different relationships, I think you can understand why it would be necessary to really explain. And Elizabeth really just said it. She's like, oh my God, it took you 30 minutes to explain this to us. Like, we have to find a way to somewhat efficiently tell buyers and sellers who we work for in the transaction. And that's called agency disclosure or disclosure of agency, or giving people agency options. We do that with a document called the Working with Real Estate Agents Disclosure Form. The Working with Real Estate Agents Disclosure, and this is North Carolina specific, is a form that's used in North Carolina anytime we are talking to a buyer or a seller. Notice it says sellers and buyers. So we don't use it in leases. It's not used in all transactions. It's not used in leases. It's only used when we're talking to buyers and sellers. And it says we must do it no later than something called first substantial contact, which is the moment that person, that buyer or that seller, shares personal and confidential information about themselves. I want to be real clear with you. I can't, as a real estate broker, have first substantial contact while my mouth is moving. No matter what we talk about, it's not first substantial contact if I'm the one talking. Because if I'm the one talking, which way is information flowing?
From the agent to the customer client.
The agent to the customer, right? Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
And I love that Seth used the word customer, because at this point they are all what?
Customers.
Customers. This is before they hire us. it can't be first substantial contact until the flow of information reverses, until the customer is the one giving information about what?
Themselves.
Themselves. If I have a 15-minute conversation with somebody and they never tell me anything at all personal about themselves, have we ever had first substantial contact?
No.
And so if we've never had first substantial contact, do you think I was required to give them and explain them the working with real estate agents disclosure form?
No, not really. No, you don't have to.
So on the test, they're going to ask you a lot about when this form should be presented. Unfortunately, they're never going to actually give you the phrase first substantial contact. If people do that all the time, they memorize first substantial contact, first substantial contact, first substantial contact, and then it never shows up on the test. What is going to show up on the test are going to be situations where you have to recognize first substantial contact. Is everybody good with me on that?
Yeah.
So first substantial contact is the first time that the customer gives the licensee any personal information about themselves, anything about themselves that might be useful in the transaction. That is considered first substantial contact. And why is that such an important point in time? Because at that point, we have to stop the conversation and explain to this person who we are, why we're there, and find out if they want to hire us or not. Does that make sense for everybody? There's a point in time, basically, at which the real estate commission says you have to. So think of it this way. You maybe never have thought of it this way, but I'm going to see if I can get you to think of it this way. Is there a profession you can think of that when they have an interaction with the public under certain circumstances, they are required to tell that member of the public, be careful what you say to me, because what you say might be used against you at some point in the future? Is there a profession where that's required?
Yeah, police.
Yeah, right. Real estate agents. Exactly. But no, also police, the Miranda warning, right? You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be what?
Used against you.
And will be used against you. Well, guess what? We have our own version of the Miranda warning in North Carolina for real estate. And it's called the Working with Real Estate Agents Disclosure Form. Because what we're supposed to essentially say to these people is, listen, I'm not your agent yet. You just remember what we said, what triggers this. They just gave us what kind of information about themselves?
Personal.
So what we need to warn them is stop talking. I'm not your agent.
I don't want to know anything.
Because anything you tell me, I can and will what?
Use against
you. Because here's the thing. They might end up hiring us. And of course, if they hire us, we would never use the information against them. But they haven't done that yet. Does that make sense for everybody? So it's like a warning. Hey, if you're going to hire me, great. But if you're not, stop talking now. It's not a good idea to keep going. And that's the Working with Real Estate Agents disclosure. So look at this scenario here. It says real estate agent Karen meets Jack at his home on Main Street to discuss what it might be worth. And Jack says that he is curious because he lives alone now that his wife died. Is that first substantial contact?
Yes.
Absolutely. That is absolutely first substantial contact. The minute that Jack shares with this real estate agent that he lives alone now because his wife died, that is like a triggering event to say, well, I'm so sorry to hear that, sir. Before we go any further, let me let you know, I'm not your agent. So, don't tell me things like what you might be willing to sell your house for, or how much you want for it, or, anything like that, because, I would never want to use any of that against you. Isn't that kind of a fair way to treat people?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Saying, hey, I don't represent you yet.
I
If you want me
love
to, I'll be happy to.
this in all of our real estate rules in North Carolina. This is my favorite one because I call this the anti-scumbag rule. This is when we're supposed to actually be like upstanding and kind human beings and say, you really shouldn't keep telling me that. It's not good for you to keep talking right now, and so that's the point of this. Look at this one. It says Tim is a new provisional broker who's hung his license with Keller Williams of Greenville and is going around a neighborhood knocking on doors and talking to homeowners about potentially selling their house. The James family is a married couple who owns the home at 242 Oak Drive and meet with Tim. After an introduction, Tim informs Mr. and Mrs. James that their house might sell for more than $400,000 in the current market. Is this first substantial contact or not? No, because it never said a thing in the world about the sellers, the owners, the James family giving Tim information. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yep.
Yes.
The only information came from Tim. So he has not had first substantial contact with these people, which means he's not required at this point to necessarily go over the working with real estate agents disclosure. Good. How about this one? It says Dawn is a potential home buyer who is surfing the internet and looking at properties that are on the market. She's on the website of a local brokerage firm and clicks get more information. On the form where Dawn provides her contact information, she notes that she's not yet pre-qualified and may have some credit issues to work through. Is this first substantial contact? Now keep in mind, she's not talking to anybody. She's just filling out some form on some real estate agent's website. And she puts in there, I'm not yet qualified. I got to fix my credit, but I got a question about this house. Is that first?
Personal? Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Credit issues.
It is, because this is a buyer or a seller who is sharing some type of personal information with you that might impact them in the transaction if a transaction were to happen. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Okay. And so when we reach out to this person, when we reach out to Dawn, the first thing we should say to Dawn is, well, before we go any further, I need to let you know I'm not your agent. So please don't tell me anything else about yourself. And if you do end up hiring me, which would be great, you could tell me anything you wanted to because I keep it confidential, but right now I'm not your agent. And that's kind of the launching point for the working with real estate agents disclosure form. So take a look at this real quick.
Alicia attends an open house in Fuquay-Varina. She is not represented by a real estate agent. Alicia enters the house and is immediately impressed by the floor plan. She asks Dawn, the listing agent, if the house is available for a quick move-in. Dawn says yes, and Alicia is enthused. She tells Dawn that she needs to purchase a home within 30 days to start a new job and will send him an offer by the end of the day.
So let's talk about that then. What do y'all think? Have we had first substantial contact in that interaction right there?
Yes.
I think
moving in 30 days.
I think Alicia, with giving her information about the job and the need to move in 30 days, has clearly given personal confidential information about herself. Everybody agree with that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely first substantial contact. So now here's the real question. What does Dawn need to do at this point in order to stay in compliance with real estate commission rules? Now that we've established that this is first substantial contact, what needs to happen to keep him in compliance? And that is where the disclosure form comes in. This is the working with real estate agents disclosure form in North Carolina. It's actually a one-page form that has two different versions. It has a version that you give to potential buyers and a separate version that you give to potential sellers. There's two versions of this form. By the way, this is new, fresh, hot off the presses. This form was just updated for the first time since 1994, as of July 1 of this year. It used to be a little purple brochure that we've been using since 1994. And this is the brand new version, and it is much improved. Much improved, in my opinion.
Travis.
Yes, Taj.
Question for you. Okay. So say for instance, we are the listing agent for this property that we're talking about here.
Yep.
And Alicia says, hey, I want to just, I'm about to move in 30 days, blah, blah, blah. I want to place an offer. She is still not our client. She is still a customer.
Correct.
Even though she's still a customer, is she required to fill out this disclosure form in order to submit an offer, even if she says she's moving in 30 days?
Well, the way you ask it, the answer is no. But let me be clear. You said, is she required to fill out this form? And the answer to that question is always no. We are required to present the form to this potential buyer or seller. So we are required to present her, but she wouldn't be under no obligation to fill it out.
Okay, but I just want to make sure, even if she's not our client, we still have to present this to her.
Correct. Nobody's our client when we present this. That's the key about this thing. This is the first meaningful conversation we've ever had with this person. Remember what prompted us to get to this form. This is the first time this person has ever given us personal information about themselves. They're not our client yet. Everybody is a what when we're giving them this form?
Customer.
Yeah, it's a customer. But I was going back off of the scenario. I'm assuming in that scenario, the previous one that we had, we already have a client. So we would not be interested in having her as a client because we already have a client.
But here's the thing, Taj. I never said you present this form to people who you want to be your clients. I said you have to present this form to any buyer or any seller with who you have first substantial contact. This is not them hiring you.
Okay.
This is you telling them who you work for.
Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Does that help?
Yep.
This is the warning. This is not you saying, hey, can you hire me? This is the, hey, let me tell you who I work for before you keep blabbering about yourself. Okay. Good question. So it applies to all sales transactions, residential, commercial, vacant land. The key word here is sales. Be very careful of that. It does not apply to what kind of transactions. What other type of transactions would not be covered by this form?
A lease.
Rentals
or leases.
Rental.
I made a mistake doing that one time and I looked really dumb.
Yeah, we do not use this in lease situations, okay? And so it's broken down into these 5 sections, and we're going to take a look as we go to the form. Now, this is the rule, which I spend very little time quoting the rules in this class, and I'm not going to do it here. I just want to point out to you that it does say in every real estate sales transaction, right? In every real estate sales transaction, it says a broker shall at what point?
First substantial contact.
First substantial contact with a prospective buyer or seller, provide them with a copy of the publication and review it with them. So our job is to present the document to them. This is what's in the very first box up there, and this might make you feel better, Taj. Look at the very first thing that's on the top of this document. They are not, they being the buyer or seller here, are not in any way agreeing to hire us because this is not a what?
A contract.
Yes,
Not a contract.
it's not a contract, right? This is in no way a contract. And it even goes on to say signing it only means you've received it. Even if you sign it, it only means you have received it, okay? And then look, it says in a sales transaction, it's important that you understand whether an agent represents you. And so remember, you're explaining this process to this person. And then it tells them what you're supposed to be doing. So don't screw it up, because they're going to look at it later and say, well, Elizabeth didn't do it that way. It says, real estate agents are required to review this form with you at first substantial contact before asking for or receiving your confidential information, and give you a copy of the form after you sign it. This is for your protection. Okay. And then I actually like this last one the best. Look at what it tells them not to do. Right there on the form. Remember, this is the first conversation you have with this person. Talk about the real estate commission taking a shot across the bow right here at you. It says, do not share what?
Any confidential
information.
Confidential information with a real estate agent, or assume the agent is acting on your behalf until you've entered into a written agreement with the agent to represent you. And this to me is as blunt as it gets, folks.
That's what I'm saying. How more straightforward can you get than that?
Otherwise, they may do what with your information?
Share it with
Against you.
They may use it against you. Isn't this very similar to you have the right to remain silent because anything they can and will be used against you? Very similar.
Also, it's abbreviated the WWREA.
Yeah, you'll see that a lot. WWREA, which is not like the World Wrestling Federation or something like that. It's working with real estate agents disclosure.
That's how I'm listing it in your recaps. I didn't want you to be like, what is this?
Now, in the middle of the page, there are some lines here for you to check. Notice it says note to agent. So this is not going to be for this potential buyer or seller that you're talking to fill out. Alicia, did you have a question? I didn't want to skip your question. I'm sorry, I just noticed. Was that from earlier that I missed? Maybe. Must have been from earlier.
Sorry. So we are required to hand out this form, but even though we are required to give it to them, they are not required to sign it, correct?
That is correct. We're going to talk about the signature panel here in just a minute, but that is correct. There is no requirement that they actually sign it. We are just required to present it to them, and we hope that they will sign it. Okay. So look at this. This is for us. This section is for us, not for them. It says check all relationship types below that may apply to this seller. So basically, this is the menu, folks. Remember that same menu we went through earlier about the different forms of agency that were available? Okay.
Yeah.
The only one that you don't see on here is exclusive buyer agency. The reason you don't see that is because this is the version you would be giving to a who?
Seller.
To a seller. There's a different version for a buyer. So basically, here are the 4 ways that we could work with a seller as a real estate firm. If you're trying to get them to hire you, you would check this line right here, because you're trying to get them to hire you as seller agency. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay. Now notice, they're not hiring you if you check this line. You're just saying, this is a service we would like to offer you. If your firm is going to offer them dual agency at any point in time, guess what you do? Check that line too. If
you just started, if you're at an open house, right, and they walk in and say, gosh, this house doesn't need any work at all, we could move in right away. And then you sit them down, and you're going to go through all this stuff with them at that point?
Yes. Now keep in mind, you're talking about buyers, and this is the seller version, but same idea, right? Same general idea.
Okay.
And so you're not going to go through all of the dual agency stuff with them, because here's all you're going to say. It pretty much says here all you need to tell them. If your firm practices dual agency, here's what it says. Dual agency will occur if your listing firm has a buyer client who wants to purchase your property. If you agree, the real estate firm and any agent within the same firm would be permitted to represent you and the buyer at the same time. A dual agent's loyalty would be divided between you and the buyer, but the firm and its agents must treat you and the buyer fairly and equally, and cannot help you gain an advantage over the other party. It's meant to be a very short and sweet description of dual agency. Now, again, just because we checked it doesn't mean we're selecting it. It means you're going to offer it to them. Your firm does this. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
So if your firm does designated agency, you would also check that line because that's something they would have as an option if they chose to hire you. Now, let's talk about the last one real quick, and we don't want to spend much time on it. Look at this one right here. Is it possible every once in a while that you could be talking to a seller that you have no hope of representing? You're talking to them, they're a seller, but you're not talking to them about representing them. You're talking to them because they're selling their house and you want to represent a buyer who's making an offer. Is that possible?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. And that's when you would check this line down here. If you're a buyer's agent and they're a FSBO, and it says here, I mean, talk about being blunt. Look, I love this description. It says the agent who gave you this form will not be representing you and has no loyalty to you. The agent will represent only the buyer. Do not share any confidential information with this agent. Now remember, it's talking about you who just handed them the thing. It's saying this person, the one who just handed you this form, don't trust them because they don't work for you. It doesn't get much more straightforward than that. How do we feel about
I
that?
do have one.
Okay, go ahead, Wade.
I'm sorry. A quick question. Now, when I was in Jersey and I sold that dual agency, I would explain it, you know, if we get a buyer for your property, we have to use fair dealing, can't give either one of you an unfair advantage throughout the transaction. But now, and that's what that paragraph says. But earlier we were saying that we can't give the buyer any information. So we're only giving them an unfair advantage.
When did we say that? I didn't say we couldn't give the buyer information. I said we can't give advice. But we also wouldn't give advice.
I guess when we were talking about the 4 foot of water.
Yeah, but no, with the water, the question was, what should I do about the water in the basement? Well, that's advice. What should I do? We would tell them about the water, but not tell them what to do with it. That would be advice.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I ask you a quick question? I understand the form. I understand the agents checking all of these off, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I have a sort of an off the wall question though.
Okay.
But answer this first. So when I fill this out, who do I send it to? Do I send it to the Real Estate Commission?
No, you simply keep it in your records.
Oh, okay.
Keep it in your records.
Well, that brought up another question. What is this going to be used for? I mean, you know, I'm going to keep a stack of these.
That's exactly right.
In case someone tries to sue me or something?
In case someone tries to sue you, or in case the Real Estate Commission ever comes to audit your files and say, are you presenting this? You would have documentation that you are indeed telling people what their choices are when it comes to agency.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to know what was the real reason behind all of this. I understand the documentation though.
Right, it's documentation, it's warning them, it's setting them up for success, hopefully, so they understand, hey, this, because here's what happens. Do you think people start talking to us and assume we work for them right from the get-go? Like they just start oversharing, they get verbal diarrhea and tell us their whole life story?
Yes.
Yes, and so we need to say to them, hey, I'm not your agent yet. Hold on. If you want to hire me, that's great. Okay, we'll get to that part, but not yet. Don't tell me all that yet.
Hold the horses.
Okay. This is the signature section. And one of the things that you will undoubtedly be tested on, signature is not required on this form, folks. There is no requirement that they sign it. It would be great if they do. Obviously, we would prefer that they sign it, but there is no requirement that they sign it. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. You just met this person. Like, you know, think about it. What triggered you doing this? They told you that they need to sell their house quickly. Well, now you got to give them this big long form. Aren't people going to be somewhat resistant to signing a form 30 seconds after you first met them?
Yeah.
Yes. And the Real Estate Commission, they do a lot of silly things, but in my opinion, they got this one right by saying, okay, if they won't sign it, it's no big deal. Here's what you do if they don't sign it. You can literally just write up here, refuse to sign. And then you would put your name on it, your license number, and the firm name. And that's what you would keep in your records. You would keep, you say, I presented this to this seller on this day. They refused to sign it, and put it in your file, and you're done. Don't skip it though. Still present it, still explain it, whether they signed it or not. How do we all feel about that part?
Good. What if we can we take a snapshot of this and send it to them by message or by email, or does it have to be a paper copy?
No, it can be anything. Email's fine, paper copies fine, electronic digital document signatures are fine. All of that works. All of that works.
Okay.
I prefer it electronically. It's easier. You know, send it to them electronically. They can click it to sign it if they want. There is a separate version for buyers, but it's basically the same form. I don't need to spend any additional time talking about it. You get the same options with buyer agency, dual agency, designated dual agency. You're just checking the boxes that might apply, but except instead of presenting it to a seller, you're presenting it to a buyer. There's just two separate versions. Give them the one that's appropriate for them. Same thing is true about the signature panel with the buyer. Is it required that they sign it? What do y'all think?
No.
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 No required signature here. They do not have to sign it. Okay. There is no requirement that they sign. It would be nice if they do. If they don't, they don't. Here's a question for you, because I think you get too in your own way. Let's say the buyer refuses to sign this. I'm not signing that shit. Could they still end up hiring you down the road and using you as their agent? Would that be okay, even though they never signed the working with real estate agents disclosure?
Yes.
Yes, because it's understood that down the road, they might be more open to, oh, he's not so bad. And then they sign a buyer agency agreement. So it doesn't prevent you from working with it. Right.
Yes.
And Tyler asked a great question. Well, if they do sign it, they're not under any obligation. That's exactly right. This is not a contract. It's not an agreement of any type, you know.
It's a disclosure. It's purely a disclosure.
Purely disclosure. There's nothing here that they're committing to. Okay. No contract at all, no agreement. It's just the way we are required to review the agency choices that they have available to them. And I can't stress enough, it's not required that they sign it.
So if they go on a Sunday to open houses and they go to 3 open houses and they open their mouths to all 3 agents,
they should get 3 times. They should. That's exactly right. If they share information about themselves 3 times. And listen, I have had first substantial contact in the drive-through before. I didn't want to, but I did. I mean, I was teaching a class one day and I went to the drive-thru at Burger King to get my lunch. And I pull up to the drive-thru window and I still had a mic, wear a lavalier microphone when I teach in person. And I still had the microphone clipped to my shirt, to my tie. And the lady was taking my credit card and she saw the microphone clipped on and she said, "What are you, the weatherman?" And sort of laughed at me. And I said, "No, not the weatherman. I'm teaching a class." And she said, "Oh, what kind of class you teach?" I said, "I have a real estate school. I'm teaching a real estate class and we're on lunch break." And she said, "Oh, honey, I need to talk to you. Me and my husband, we've been thinking about buying a house, but he's got terrible credit. His last wife, they just ruined his credit and he cannot get a loan no matter how hard we try." And I'm saying,
diarrhea of the mouth.
Oh my God, shut up. I don't want to do this right now. But is that first substantial contact, folks?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because she's talking about potentially buying a house and she's sharing information with him. Whether I wanted it or not, she did it. And that's first substantial contact.
So you had to give it up, that paper in Burger King?
I got my damn Whopper and went back to the office. I'm not perfect. Nobody is, you know, no. I mean, that is really, here's the thing. And even the people at the real estate commission in their quiet moments will tell you, nobody's ever going to be in compliance with this rule 100% of the time, because it's impossible. People do overshare all the time. They just, I mean, especially when they find out you're a real estate agent, you'd be, maybe you wouldn't be shocked, but I'm always shocked by, like, you know, I'll be in line at the grocery store and somebody will overhear me talking on a cell phone or whatever. And they'll say, "Oh, you're in real estate." And I say, "Yeah, I am. And they're like, "Gosh, we've been thinking about selling our house, you know, because it really needs some work done to it. But I mean, it looks like our neighbors are getting like $500,000 for theirs. And if we could get that, we would take it in a hot minute." Is that personal confidential information right there that they would take $500,000?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
There it is. I'm not stopping in the grocery store to do the working with real estate agents disclosure there. So nobody's going to be perfect, but if you will at least make a point of reminding yourself, if it's a formal conversation, if you really are talking to this person and they realize it's a conversation about a transaction, make sure you're doing this. I mean, because honestly, it's a really great way, in my experience, it's a really great way to build the relationship from a good starting point. It builds trust with people if you do it the right way. Because I have been in situations where people would start talking about themselves and I would say, "Well, before you go any further, let me let you know, I don't represent you yet. And so it's probably not in your best interest to tell me a bunch of personal things, because I do represent a lot of buyers and sellers in this neighborhood, and I could end up working against you. And I would never want to use anything against you that you had told me. So just kind of hold off on anything personal, confidential, since I don't work for you. Maybe I will work for you and that'll be great. But if right now I don't." And I've had people just go, "Wow. Oh, I appreciate that." You know, and so the ones that are paying attention, it can really help build a relationship if you do it the right way. So that is the end of unit 3. What is that? 3.3, 3.4? Yeah, 3.4. That's it. Look at that.
Yay.
And right at 3 o'clock.
Today we need a margarita.
Yes.